Hey, legends! It's Chronos back with part 3 of What If Deku Had Metal Manipulation. Big shout out to BT for keeping this amazing story going. Your continuous support means the world to me, and it's what keeps these videos coming. If you're excited for more Deku action and love these what if scenarios, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Let's jump right into the next chapter of Deku's metal manipulation journey. Chapter 10. Love is like battle training. Izuku. It wasn't a very well-advertised fact that one didn't actually need to have attended a hero university to be licensed as a pro. Izuku's pen scratched over the well-worn pages of Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 7. When had he started this particular book? 6. Maybe 7th grade? It was long enough ago that combing through it now he was reminded of little tidbits of information he'd forgotten over the years. Not to mention his sense of humor as a child was eccentric, to say the least. Needless to say, it had been a while since he'd read this specific volume, but considering who he'd just met a few hours previously, it was a given that he'd revisit this particular entry. Izuku's pen tapped thoughtfully against the page. A provisionary license could only be obtained through a reputable enough hero institution, but an official hero license could be obtained by any working professional through a recommendation of an already licensed hero. That wasn't to say that any average Joe could become a hero without any effort. They'd still have to pass an exam judged by a panel of officials like anyone else. Besides, why would a pro ever risk their own reputation for someone who hadn't even put in the time and effort to achieve greatness? There was a reason it wasn't very well known. In fact, Izuku could count on one hand the number of active pros that hadn't come from a school like UA. Why was this at all relevant? Well, ironically one of them taught here. Izuku peered down at the name titling the entry. Ishiyama Ken, better known by his hero name, Cementos, had actually graduated from one of Tokyo's most prestigious universities with a master's degree in architecture. Though he'd unofficially studied several other disciplines that complemented his ability to erect cement structures in an instant. Ken spent nearly half a decade in the business traveling around the world using his quirk to restore homes to those suffering from natural disasters and catastrophic villain attacks alike. He only shifted his focus to hero work after being recommended personally by All Might himself. The symbol of peace had somehow caught wind of Ishiyama's relief efforts and spent weeks convincing the man to become a hero. A few years later, and Cementos cracked his way into the top 100 with a passionate and unyieldingly loyal fan base. One that was well-deserved in Izuku's opinion. Even with Ishiyama shifting his focus to teaching in the most recent years, he still tried to devote a few months of the year to his original passion. But knowing about Cementos' skill was one thing. Seeing the results for his own eyes, though, this felt like Izuku's own bed. He glanced to the walls. Yet, those were his hero photos, and he'd recognize the diagrams of his own creation anywhere. They were even arranged in the same way he was used to. The same wooden computer desk sat flush with the wall to the left of his bed, exactly where it was located back home. And yet, this building hadn't even existed this morning. Izuku knew that for a fact. He'd rolled by the clearing on the way to class himself, and there was no way he would have missed the massive building that was the UA dorms for the hero course. Considering how they'd been instructed to drop off all their belongings the previous morning, Cementos must have created the building around all their furnishings. There was no other way they could have finished in a single day. Izuku didn't even want to think of the logistics involved with creating a building with fully working plumbing and electricity already installed. He was still trying to wrap his head around how fine-tuned the man's control must be to have that level of precision with his quirk. It was certainly a level to strive towards. Izuku flung Volume 7 across the room without a look. The book landed with unerring accuracy on his desk. Yep, exactly the same spot. Izuku dipped a hand into the river of quick steel suspended above his bed, relaxing as the cool material parted between his fingers. He willed it to flow in curving spirals through the air, a never-ending loop with neither beginning nor end. Izuku had never realized just how much sensory feedback his quirk really gave him until it had been forcefully ripped away. Having a telekinetic connection to the metal, every subtle vibration, even a slight change in temperature was noticeable. He'd of course recognized some of these things before. He would have had to be blind to miss some of them. But by this point in his life, his quirk really was a part of him, and Izuku consequently took certain aspects of it for granted. But it was a mistake he doubted he'd ever repeat. Not with such a jarringly empty sensation so fresh in his mind. There was just something so inherently wrong about having it taken away. Izuku imagined it would be like a normal person waking up without an arm. He sighed heavily. Maybe holding back in Aizawa's test had been more trouble than it was worth? God. He could just imagine the shit-eating grin Kaken give him if she ever heard that thought. Izuku stood by his reasoning, but Aizawa was right about one thing. His classmates needed to know what he was capable of. A solid knock at his door cut through his musings. In a rare show of laziness, Izuku stretched a thin tendril of quick steel to open the door rather than get up from the bed himself. He knew who it probably was anyway. Doesn't even get off his ass to greet me, Katsumi drawled haughtily, strolled into his room. He leveled a deadpan stare at the girl, doing his best to ignore the miles of lead exposed by her orange cotton shorts. You've tried to open your door with your quirk before, Kaken. How's that glass house treating ya? She stuck her tongue out playfully before unceremoniously flopping down beside him. She heaved a heavy gust of air, as if letting the stress of the day fade away. The silence they shared wasn't uncomfortable by this point in their friendship. Izuku knew despite her normally caustic nature, Katsumi didn't speak without purpose. If she had something on her mind, she'd speak up about it. But there were other factors to consider. Izuku would be lying if he said having her live body in bed with him didn't have his mind racing in a completely different direction. He could just feel the heat of her body radiating through the sheets. Izuku turned his head, searching out those particularly captivating crimson eyes, only to meet closed eyelids. What was going on in that unpredictable mind of hers? What do you think of our new classmates, Kaken? The question had heavy implications. They'd both had their differences of some kind with most of the kids in their previous schools. He was practically the school whipping boy until he'd gotten a handle on how to deal with bullies. And Kaken was either blindly praised or challenged for prestige for most of her upper grade years. It had left them both isolated, albeit in completely different ways. Izuku grinned to himself. It had to be fate that they ended up lying side by side all these years later. With a couple hiccups along the way, of course. He swirled his fingers through the streams of quick steel, expanding them into a latticework of interconnecting strands reaching to the edges of his room, never ceasing their gentle flow. It really served no actual purpose besides possibly improving his control, but more than anything else, he'd liken it to a nervous tick. Despite being completely inanimate, Quicksteel always gave off a sense of liveliness, at least in his opinion. Perhaps it was just that he was so emotively connected with the material that he felt this way, but seeing it now, flowing around the room in a constant state of motion, it only made him more certain. They're a pain. He flinched slightly, having been so absorbed by his quirk. But as Katsumi's hand joined his own in trailing through the cool metal threads, he realized belated that she was answering his own question. Oh, Izuku said curiously. That was actually a fairly decent review considering the girl's normal opinion of those she considered below her. She fixed him with narrowed eyes, quirking her lips to one side. The fuck you mean, oh? Nothing. He smiled. Just better than pebbles on the side on your road to greatness. Or extras, or… Alright, I fucking get it already. In a flash of moment, Izuku found his arms pinned to his sides, Kaken's hand silencing any words of protest that may have left his mouth. Not that he'd ever protest the way her strong legs straddled his chest as she loomed over him. Don't think I've forgotten about earlier, nerd, she murmured, eyes glinting dangerously. He knew she'd meant it to be menacing, but God, she was beautiful. If Katsumi wanted to punish him, then she was certainly going about it the wrong way. Izuku was surprised she couldn't hear the way his heart thundered in his chest. His quirk indicated no rapid change in temperature, but Izuku would swear the room had just gotten 10 degrees hotter. He wasn't sure what had possessed his body in that moment. It may have been merely a whim, or perhaps his steely control over his attraction for his best friend slipped for a moment. But with a twitch of speed, Izuku had reversed their positions, leaving Katsumi flat on her back. The light squeak she'd let out at the sudden movement had been a treat in itself. But Izuku wished he could preserve the utterly unguarded look of shock that appeared on Kaken's face in that moment. His own arms caged her torso, leaving just enough room for her to squirm comfortably, not that she tried to, stunned as she was. Katsumi peered up at him. Ash blonde hair flattened around her head in a halo with disbelief written so plainly in her eyes. But alongside that emotion were others. Pride being heavily featured, but alongside it was also an honest fondness and even desire? There was nothing, however, that said she didn't welcome the action itself. He wanted to kiss her. It obviously hadn't been the first time he'd had the urge, or the 100th, but in that moment, with his best friend and her lethal weapon of a body so absolutely vulnerable before him, how could she expect him to hide his affections through all of that? He was only a man. So for once in his life, Izuku ignored the possibility of ruining his one true friendship, ignored the threat of being rejected by the only girl he'd ever loved, and finally embraced the undeniable fact that he couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. So he kissed her. For a moment, Izuku feared her shock had left her unresponsive, and the kiss may have been even more one-sided than he'd feared. But after a moment that dragged on like nothing before, Katsumi slowly responded, her lips joining his own in a gentle dance. How something so soft could spew such profanity at times Izuku didn't know nor care. But as he finally claimed the lips of his best friend and crush after so many years, his heart soared in triumph. It was clumsy. Neither had any sort of experience with the opposite sex, and figuring out through trial and error the ideal angle to meet each other was undeniably awkward at first. But it was undeniably wonderful for Izuku, and judging from the appreciative little gasps Katsumi let out, she probably didn't have many complaints either. They'd spent nearly their entire lives together. A little embarrassment between the two was nothing new. And as Katsumi lightly parted her lips with a gasp a moment later, they found that a little embarrassment could make things a lot more interesting as well. Izuku slipped his tongue past her lips, probing tentatively around her mouth before teasing at her own a moment later. He ghosted his fingers up the exposed skin of her leg, creeping closer the soft fabric of her sleep shorts. She shivered delightfully against his body. Katsumi deepened the kiss, fisting a hand in his hair as she seemingly grew more and more confident. It wasn't surprising, really. She was always a quick study, especially with something so instinctual. Izuku pulled away slightly, peppering kisses down her jaw, then her neck. He nuzzled at her affectionately, biting lightly at her collarbone. She squirmed at the sensation, seeming to enjoy the teasing gesture, but a moment later, her eyes flew wide open and she scrambled away, practically launching off the bed. It took a moment for his mind to catch up by Kaken's sudden departure. Had he done something wrong? Had he read too much into her response? He thought she was as into it as he was. But maybe he'd been mistaken. His heart sank at the thought. Katsumi shot up, lips still enticingly swollen from their earlier embrace. But the haze of lust that had clouded Izuku's mind was overshadowed by the concern that had wedged its way into his gut. Katsumi's eyes darted around the room like a caged animal looking everywhere but at his own. I've got to get to bed. We've got, shit, class tomorrow. Wait, catch. Thud. Before he'd realized it, she was gone. His door slamming shut, leaving Izuku alone, confused and painfully aroused. What the fuck? Katsumi. Sumi, hey, Katsumi-chan. Against her better judgment, Katsumi paused, waiting for Roundface to catch up. But she wasted not time in setting off nearly immediately once the brunette had done so. Hey, Katsumi-chan. I'm super excited for class 2, but don't you think we should wait for Izuku-kun? Katsumi tensed, inwardly cursing at hot flush that came to her cheeks. Gravity Girl had only mentioned his fucking name, and she was already losing it. How the hell was she supposed to focus on her first real day at UA, when all she could think about was the gentle caress of his lips, or the hot tickle of his breath on her neck? Explosive touches and, "Nope," she said without a backward glance. Katsumi let out a sigh as the taps of Uraraka's steps resumed a moment later. The tag-alongs from middle school usually fucked off after a dismissal like that. But Katsumi had to admit, Gravity Girl was a whole other level of stubborn. Was this what it was like to have friends that were girls? So far it seemed to be far more trouble than it was worth. All right then, as long as he won't mind. She let out an innocent chuckle. You'd probably know better than I would, huh? Gah. You're too trusting, Roundface. The truth was she'd fucking chickened out, okay? As wonderful and as mind-blowing finally acting on some of her urges the previous night was, Katsumi had absolutely no clue where she and the nerd stood now. He'd kissed her first, right? She vaguely recalled him pinning her to his bed. But had she imagined that part? It certainly seemed more in character for Dream Deku than real Deku. How the hell was she supposed to tell them apart anymore? Katsumi had definitely imagined him kissing her in the past, and for a moment had trouble discerning her dreams from reality. But after she'd realized it wasn't a dream, such an insignificant detail had seemed wholly unimportant in the greater scheme of things. But now? Her mind had caught up to her body as she realized she'd practically assaulted the nerd. Katsumi flushed at the thought of her full-blown panic attack. They'd only gotten to second base before she bolted, citing an urgent need for sleep of all things. What a fucking joke. But once she'd gotten back to her own room, Katsumi had lied awake for hours pondering just what might have happened if she'd stayed. Katsumi cringed, thinking back on her sudden departure. What the hell did Deku think of her now? Bailing on him like that she'd be surprised if he even wanted a repeat performance. She cursed under her breath, chewing the tip of her thumb irritably. For nearly a decade the nerd had remained unquestioningly by her side. But they'd been best friends, and it had been simple, and most of the time, effortless. As exhilarating as this change was, it was also so distinctly new, carrying with it an air of uncertainty. Katsumi didn't do well with uncertainty, at least in this respect. Gosh, you're totally out of it this morning, huh? Katsumi-chan? Is everything okay? She sighed, waving off the brunette's worries. As guilty as she felt about leaving for class early to avoid talking to Deku so soon, she really did need the extra time to get her fucking head on straight. Today they were supposed to be taught by All Might after all. Izuku, I am. Coming through the door like a normal person. It's actually him. We're actually getting taught by All Might. Whoa. That's his Silver Age costume. He gets bold text too. Gives me goosebumps. There was nothing normal about All Might's entrance, but you couldn't really hold that against him. The man seemed to radiate a heroic energy everywhere he walked, and Izuku doubted he could just switch it off any easier than Hagakure could turn off her invisibility. However, even the prospect of learning from the legend himself couldn't completely distract him from his current predicament. As All Might boisterously outlined the details of hero basic training, Izuku couldn't help but shift his gaze to the girl sitting just one seat in front of him. She appeared to be focusing intently on their sensei, just like she had in the more mundane classes they'd had that day. But he could tell from her posture that her mind was on other things. Of course it was, idiot. With the way she'd taken off the previous night, he wasn't surprised Katsumi had left early that morning, but he couldn't help but feel the bitter sting of rejection. He was so confused. Kissing Katsumi had honestly been one of the greatest moments of his life, and if he'd been reading her body language correctly, it wasn't half bad for her, either. At least until she'd left so suddenly. Maybe he shouldn't have gotten so handsy with her adult training, and for that, you need these. It only took a split second for Izuku's mind to catch up as a row of futuristic shelving units ejected from the walls with a gentle hiss. In accordance with the Cork Registry, and the special request forms you filled out before being admitted. The class collectively leaned forward in anticipation. No way. He doesn't mean. Nearly every child in this Cork society, they all lived and had dreamed at one point or another about this day. And now they'd finally get their chance. That's right. A hero's signature, so to say. Hero costumes. All Might said, spreading his arms grandly. Once you've changed, come out in ranking order and meet me at ground beta. Katsumi. Damn, Yamamo. I didn't know you were so daring, came a shout from the pinkest of her new classmates. Just ignore them. Katsumi, you've got battle training with All Might to worry about. She pulled on a pair of jet black combat boots, a neon orange strap latching around the back of her calves. It wasn't purposeful. All I said was there needed to be an appropriate amount of skin, showing to use my quirk. They didn't have to make the rest skin tight. Pfft. Sure, girl. Keep telling yourself that. But really, whose eye out there are you trying to catch? Don't explode the extras. What makes you think I have any intentions of? Come on. There must be someone who's caught your interest? We're in the hero course after all. All those battle-hardened, hero-worthy physiques. The pink one drawled provocatively. We've got the pick of the damn litter, ladies. Kirishima's body isn't exactly carved from marble, but he gets pretty damn close, Mina? Lobes cut into the debate with a sly look. Or at least that's what Katsumi assumed, because she absolutely refused to have any association with this conversation. What? Oh, I dunno, Kirishima? He's kinda. If we're talking best body here, it's gotta be Midoriya, right? Katsumi stilled. Oh my god. I know, right? Did you see those arms? What a shame we only got a glimpse yesterday. Mina, can your acid dissolve clothing? Pfft. You're horrible. I couldn't do that. Not on purpose. The obnoxious giggles that followed were the final straw as a seething Katsumi spun around only for the words to die in her mouth. She froze at the sight of her classmates' hero costumes. This couldn't be right. The creation girl hadn't been fucking exaggerating. In fact, daring may have been an understatement. She wasn't even wearing pants for fuck's sake. Or they were at least hidden beneath the belts. And the skin-tight, dark red leotard that was meant to cover the voluptuous girl's upper torso wasn't doing its job very well. Shit. The others weren't much fucking better either. Katsumi's eyes darted from girl to girl. Did she miss the spandex memo, or something? Aside from lobes, every single heroine's costume hugged the girl's forms with impunity. And was Invisalign fucking naked? Even Uraraka stood several seats down from her, tugging at her own costume uncomfortably. It was no wonder why. Katsumi eyed the brunette's chest as it strained against the stretchy blue fabric. How the hell was every girl in here fucking stacked? She met Loeb's eyes for a moment, and actually shared a commiserating look with the girl. Nope. Hell the fuck no. She was not doing this right now. Katsumi glanced down at her own costume with a sigh. The compression material used for her upper torso and sleeves was tough and functional, woven from a thread in a similar manner to Kevlar, though much thinner. She totally dug the bright orange highlights too, but glancing back once more at the rest of their costumes, was it hot enough? She shook her head rapidly, making her already unmanageable hair fluff up even more. Katsumi ignored the obvious irony of the thought, instead focusing on latching the streamlined metal bracers, the most recent version of several iterations, onto each forearm. They made use of a semi-permeable membrane to wick and store her explosive for more devastating rapid-fire attacks. The same material lined the soles of her combat boots. She sighed, some of the tension leaving her frame. Without the nerd's modifications, she'd probably be walking around with fucking grenades on her wrists or something. Crimson eyes snapped open, razor-sharp and focused once more. This wasn't the time to be worried about whatever the hell was going on with her and Deku, even if it was probably her fault. Izuku's nervously adjusted the straps to the sleek, forest green bracers that guarded each of his forearms. For the first actual iteration of his hero costume, he erred on the side of practicality over aesthetic. He stuck with the standard pair of charcoal gray combat pants with a more sturdy material of the same color clinging to the contours of his chest. A green, red and white face mask wrapped around the lower half of his jaw, leaving piercing jade eyes exposed to the elements. As Izuku got his bearings and had a couple years of experience under his belt, he could ditch the light armor and rely on his quirk to protect his body. But until that time came, he'd take the extra protection. Izuku's eyes widened as the girls in his class filed out of the locker rooms, chatting as if they were lifelong friends. He hadn't prepared himself for this. Izuku knew hero costumes could get a bit revealing, but the girls really hadn't held back with their designs, had they? And despite knowing it would only distract him further, Izuku found himself searching for that familiar ash blonde hair, spotting her a moment later. Kaken had no business looking that good in Kevlar and bandoliers, but there was something about that tank girl aesthetic that really did it for him. The matte black body armor practically molded to the contours of the girl's toned midriff, only coming up to around mid-chest, leaving just a hint of tantalizing cleavage and shoulders bare. It really wasn't helping him keep his mind, or his eyes, off his friend? Gah, he didn't fucking know anymore. What was All Might saying? The heroes have a limited amount of time to either capture the villains, or secure the weapon. Weapon? What weapon? Why hadn't he been paying attention? His eyes darted to each of his classmates, as if the answer to his dilemma would be magically written on their foreheads. It wasn't. The villains must either capture the heroes, or protect the weapon until time is up. As All Might continued to explain the scenario, Izuku began to piece together what he'd missed. It sounded like some sort of cliché American blockbuster plot, but he guessed it worked as well as anything to teach them more practical skills. Your battle partners will be decided by drawing lots. The small box he held, which Izuku assumed contained the various teams, looked positively minuscule in the hero's massive hands. Is that really the best way? Ida questioned in disbelief. Oh, that's why he seemed so familiar. Izuku knew he'd seen that bionic engine mutation before, but it had taken the full body armor for him to properly make the connection. Ida had to be related to the pro-hero Ingenium. He'd studied the prodigal hero's quirk intensively, being particularly interested in mechanical mutations to the body. As little as quirks adhered to logic, having human technology develop naturally inside the body was a level of absurdity even Izuku had trouble grasping. It makes sense when you think about it, Izuku said softly, thinking back on the hundreds of battles he'd borne witness to in his time in the city. He glanced up, only to freeze seeing nearly the entire class's eyes on him. Go on, Midoriya Shonen. All Might boomed with a smile. Izuku coughed lightly into a fist in an attempt to hide how uncomfortable he was with the attention. Most heroes work for an agency where you'd indeed work with predetermined teams, he said, conceding that point to Ida with a nod. But there are multiple hero agencies patrolling a given area at any time. It's not uncommon to have to team up with people you aren't familiar with for more dire emergencies. Izuku quirked a smile at their legendary teacher. Plus, if you fly solo like some people, you've got to be able to mesh with a different hero at any given time. The class was silent for a moment. What the hell? No one told me Midoriya was smart too? I'm so freaking jealous. That really does make sense when you think about it, Yairosa chimed in. I apologize for getting ahead of myself. Please continue. Indeed, Will said. Young man, let's get to it. Each student drew a lot, with matching letters indicating pairs. Peering around, Izuku searched for whoever in their class had the C to match his own paper tag. It seemed fate had its benevolent eye on him, after all, as he met a familiar pair of crimson eyes. A crumpled paper tag was clutched in her gloved grip, the curved end of what he knew had to be a C peeking out. And as All Might called up the Team A combo of Yaoyorozu and Tokoyami to act as the villains, Izuku had no doubt that his own team would be called up to match. The fact both terrified him and filled him with relief. At least Kaken would have to talk to him, right? Katsumi. Fuck. Just a little bit of time was all she had asked for. Was that really so hard? Was wanting just another goddamn moment to herself being too greedy? But of course, she'd been paired with Deku of all people. And of course they were called up to bat the first fucking chance they'd got. Normally, she'd leap at the chance to flex her superiority in battle. And pair with the nerd too? These scrubs wouldn't have stood a chance. But she wasn't ready. Katsumi peered up through pale blonde bangs, expression softening as she saw her best friend approaching like he was walking to the gallows. Well shit. She scowled at her own selfishness. Every moment of their relationship was filled with Izuku indulging her many whims while tolerating her less, well, tolerable traits. She knew it couldn't go on like this. Knowing the nerd, he was probably blaming himself for no fucking reason, when she could have solved this whole misunderstanding with a few simple words. This was what she'd wanted after all, right? Her nerd of a best friend had turned into a total fucking hump before her eyes, and it wasn't the first time she'd thought of making a move. Was she really going to let that chance go to waste after all that time? Sparks danced inside a clenched fist along with her inner turmoil, which only made the big lug flinch away. She had to fix this. Katsumi wordlessly tugged him towards the tunnel that led to the simulated city itself. Luckily, they had 10 minutes to themselves before they'd be expected to capture the bomb or whatever. Hopefully, this wouldn't take that long. Katsumi slowed to a stop just inside the exit of the tunnel. Clear daylight speckled the ground just a couple meters away, the entrance to the mock city bright and welcoming. She turned to Izuku, finally taking a moment to take in the intimidating figure he cut in his own hero costume. Katsumi knew it was cliché to swoon over a hero in uniform, but with his sleeveless body armor, made of a similar material to her own, and those combat pants that hugged his ass like a fucking snack, she found herself for a moment, lost for words. Katsumi reached out a sparking palm, latching her fingers onto the collar of his suit. Kaken. Sormf. She wasn't sure what possessed her to silence his lips with her own in that moment, but her body had seemingly closed the distance between them of its own accord, pulling his hinged face mask away to uncover the real prize. It only took a second for her mind to catch up to her body. Fucking shit. Had she just kissed him? Was she still kissing him? Oh, he should do that thing with his tongue again. Wait, no. She was supposed to be setting things straight, not getting lost in the way his muscular arm curved around her waist ever so gently, or the way their tongues clashed in a passionate dance that was possibly the furthest thing from gentle Katsumi could imagine. Their kiss slowed to a comfortable, tender pace, and Katsumi somehow found her back against a flat surface again. The stone wall was a hell of a lot less comfortable than the nerd's bed. I'm confused? Deku said a moment after they'd parted. She sighed. That's probably my fault, Deku. She trailed off, the words failing her. Kakenwa. I chickened out, okay? She snapped angrily. None of her anger was directed at him, of course, but she'd never let that stop her before. He peered at her curiously, not blaming her in the least but seeking to understand. Typical. I'm sorry. Okay. I bailed on you, and that totally wasn't cool. She felt the heat come to her cheeks as she tried to voice her next thought. It's not Ted, I wasn't enjoying myself. What was that? Fucking shit. Nerd, you heard me. Don't make me say it again. She scowled, pacing the dark tunnel in agitation. So, we can kiss some more. God. Her face must have been fucking flaming. Fuck, Deku. You don't have to say it so plainly. Then could we, not kiss anyone else? Please. He hedged, trying to follow her direction. Katsumi couldn't help the pleasant fluttering sensation that filled her gut at the implication. I'd like to see you fucking try, nerd. She bit out, thankful for the darkness for hiding her atomic flush. Attention, Villain Team A's allotted preparation time has expired. Hero Team C may enter the premises. All Might's voice boomed over the loudspeaker, somehow appearing just as grand through a mic as he did in person. You have 10 minutes. Indoor and a personnel battle training. Begin. Shit, they'd really cut it close there. But as she met Deku's eyes with a clear conscience and their tentative relationship sorted out, at least for the moment, all that was left was to show these shitty villains the product of superior talent combined with sheer, back-breaking effort. And a little luck, of course. Katsumi grinned a bloodthirsty smile as Deku's skyboard took shape before them. Death from above? She said eagerly. He had the nerve to sigh in response. Kaken, we can't call it death from above. We're heroes. She scowled, fucking killjoy. Kashinori, Midoriya can fly? That's so fucking rad. The shot was joined by many others in a similar vein, and Yagi would be lying if he said he didn't find some amusement in his class's reaction to the young man's ability. It also had the unintended side effect of taking some of the pressure off. Yagi would happily be a hero 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without complaint. In fact, it was one of his greatest wishes, now that he was actually limited to less than 3 hours a day. But in the brief time he'd had to impart his wisdom on these impressionable youths, he was already exhausted. If this was the kind of pressure teaching put on his body, then he might have to rethink how much time a day he truly had to spare. Day by day, the time grew closer to when Yagi would no longer have the luxury of choosing his own successor, and his legendary ability would have to pass to young Mirio by default. There was nothing wrong with the boy. Quite the opposite, in fact. On paper, Mirio was the perfect vessel for one for all in mind, body, and spirit. But it just seemed so clinical, especially when compared to the bond he had with his own sensei. As painful as his memories of Nana were, he cherished the time they'd had together all the same. To simply go through the motions with a successor of someone else's choosing, even if they were a trusted friend. It felt like he'd be disgracing Nana's legacy. But then, he'd met young Midoriya. It was almost as if fate had delivered a perfect vessel to his doorstep. Disciplined, kind, and sporting a powerful quirk to match, it was no wonder the boy had caught his eye. Judging from his exemplary performance in the entrance exam, he clearly didn't lack the heart of a hero either. But there was still something holding him back, something preventing him from approaching the young man this very day. A spark was missing, and for the life of him, Yagi Tashinori simply didn't know what it was. But he knew he'd know it when he saw it, as little sense as that made. Yagi turned his shadowed eyes back to the screen. Perhaps Midoriya would know better than he. Izuku. The streamlined pair of combat boots Izuku had designed for his hero costume were working just as he'd intended. From the outside, they looked to be a variation of the stylish red sneakers he wore on a day-to-day basis. These, however, were constructed from battle-grade materials and refined to look and act a bit more streamlined. But the true genius was in the inner and outer sole of the shoe. Namely, there was no sole. That particular component had been omitted completely, allowing direct skin contact to his skyboard without losing the protective advantage of the boots themselves. A minuscule amount of quick steel served as the soles whenever he wasn't flying. The wind ruffled his hair as Izuku made a quick sweep of the perimeter of the building for a bit of early recon. There was no need to rush in guns blazing in this situation. There hadn't been any indication from the outside as to which floor the villain team had set up on. But considering who their opponents were, it wasn't exactly surprising. Yaoyorozu's creation quirk seemed to be limitless in its potential application, and as long as he had no knowledge of its limitations or drawbacks, it'd be nearly impossible to plan for every situation. As for Tokoimi's quirk, Izuku had almost nothing on it. The raven-headed boy hadn't used it at all in the quirk apprehension test the previous day, but whether that was due to not being able to, or a reason more in line with Izuku's own reasoning that day, he wasn't sure. Izuku tried to avoid prejudice whenever possible, but with a name like Tokoimi Fumikichi, there was probably a good reason why they'd avoided the rooms in direct sunlight. Izuku came gliding to a stop where he'd left Kaken by the entrance. She shot him a grin that had his stomach doing somersaults, but he shoved away the feeling, a haze of razor-sharp focus settling over his mind. "We good to go, nerd?" He nodded, no sign of them from the outside, and they're probably avoiding the outer windows since none of them are furnished at all. "So I can blast the roof off now, right, Kaken?" He sighed, praying for patience. "We're making a precise infiltration with your quirk. You know, with stealth and no noise. So can I." "Yes, you can blast the roof off," he bit out. She snickered adorably, instantly erasing any irritation that had been building. Kasumi held out a hand, wordlessly asking for an arm up onto his skyboard. "Don't you dare fucking drop me, Deku." Yeah. Drop a girl one time in the sand, and you never hear the end of it. My ass was bruised for days, nerd. Take responsibility." He flushed lightly at the thought, but pulled the girl up, wrapping an arm around her waist and tugging her close. Now that Izuku knew he could actually get away with these casual touches, and they might even be welcome, he planned to take every opportunity to indulge his wishes. He widened the base of his skyboard, so it resembled a floating platform. All jokes aside, balancing on such a precarious foundation took years of practice to achieve his level of proficiency, and that was with total command of the board itself. The fact that Katsumi could stay perched so steadily even on an expanded surface was a testament to her absurd sense of balance. He guided them to the roof of the simulation building where they settled, Kaken stepping away lightly. He couldn't help but let out a giddy shiver as she trailed the tips of her fingers over his skin, as if hesitant to lose that contact. "Wipe that grin off your face, nerd. It's showtime." Her palms burst into a smoldering, blisteringly hot flame, which she turned to the stone roof a moment later. The stealthy entrance may have been a bit optimistic, but as the concrete roof of the simulation building caved in with a shattering explosion, Izuku had no other choice but to roll with what she'd given him. He dropped through the dark hole left by Katsumi's superheated palms, surrounding himself with quick steel to protect from the molten slag along the edges. The familiar fatigue washed over him, but he shook it off easily enough, having battled the heat of Kaken's quirk for most of his life. What he wasn't expecting, however, was the massive force that slammed into him the moment he touched down into the room itself. Luckily, he'd caught a flash of darkness in his peripherals just in time to solidify his quirk, saving him from the brunt of the impact. Unfortunately, he was still flung bodily into the closest wall by the force of the blow, though not hard enough to cause any permanent damage. Izuku hissed out a curse, not knowing whether this should be considered absurdly good luck or not. He'd meant to guess the general area the villain team was hiding, not the exact room, but as they said, every good plan lasts until first contact with the enemy. Izuku ducked a humming strike from a bow staff over his left shoulder, instinctively tossing out a mule kick in the general area of the attack. He was rewarded with a solid thud and distinctly feminine grunt of pain. Izuku rolled away, trusting Kaken to guard any further attacks to his flank. Sure enough, she dropped through the hole a moment later, intersecting Yaoyorozu's staff as it cut through the air for a follow-up strike. It left Izuku completely free to focus on Tokoyami. At least, he thought it was Tokoyami. The writhing specter that loomed over him shared little in common with the reserved young man he'd met the day previously. The gaping maw of the beast was like looking directly into the void, and those menacing yellow eyes gleaming eerily in the dim lighting of the room. The hazy shadow lunged, swinging a wicked, razor-sharp claw towards a much smaller Izuku. But he stood resolute, undaunted in the face of impending danger. As formless and intangible as this shadow beast appeared, he knew firsthand that its blows were undeniably solid. Disregarding how it got the jump on him earlier, if it was solid, then it was something he could fight. A grin split his lips. Izuku deftly ducked the wild swing, a metallic fist whipping out in response. The blow cracked satisfyingly against the mass of writhing darkness, flinging it back into the dark corners of the room. For something so obviously supernatural, it felt frighteningly fleshy, like a living beast overcome by shadows. But that was a mere observation. In this fight, it meant nothing to him. This entity was merely the being standing between him and victory. Izuku parried another blow from the blackness, quick steel-coated forearms taking the brunt of the damage before he lashed out with a textbook side kick, putting some distance between he and the shadow. The beast lunged back with a vengeance, fighting with an animalistic ferocity and seemingly unending reserves of energy. As he tracked the vicious claw through the air, parrying the blow a moment later, Izuku picked out Katsumi taking on Yaoyorozu in the opposite corner of the room. The taller girl clearly wielded her bow staff with a confidence born of years of practice, but there was a brutality in Kaken's approach to battle that Yaoyorozu's technique simply didn't hold up to. Katsumi avoided using any stronger blasts in such an enclosed space, choosing to take on the bow staff with her bare hands. A hint of pride welled in his chest as Katsumi systematically disabled Yaoyorozu's formidable offense, though not without taking some solid hits from the taller girl. Even with knuckles bruised and bleeding, Kaken looked like she was having the absolute time of her life, especially as she ducked under another of the girl's strikes to deliver a devastating counter directly to her exposed ribs, activating her quirk for perhaps the first time in their little brawl. Yaoyorozu was sent tumbling to the stone floor from the power of the blow. She came to rest against one of the many pillars that filled the room, ribs battered painfully, but surprisingly still conscious. In a show of tenacity that impressed both he and Katsumi, though Izuku knew she'd never admit it, the girl struggled to her feet once more. Katsumi strafed around her opponent like a predator stalking its prey. The flames dancing at her fingertips just barely lit up her fair features, a manic grin exposing rows of pearly white teeth. In the dark lighting of the room, she looked almost as intimidating as Tokoyami. Another blow from the shroud of darkness slammed into his guard, rattling his teeth with its intensity. But as Izuku caught sight of Katsumi slipping another sparking palm through Yaoyorozu's guard, he came to a startling realization. They were being dumb as shit. As much as he hated to deny Kaken the fight she clearly wanted to finish, it would be the height of folly to not exploit such an obvious weakness. "Kaken, remember the sludge monster?" he called out. She ceased her predatory approach, eyes darting quickly to his own before settling once more on the girl heaving deep lungfuls of air before her. "Nah, what sludge monster? The fuck kinda question is that?" she said, shooting him a sarcastic glance. But as he met her eyes, he saw that she understood what he was getting at. They'd been going about it wrong the entire time. Tokoyami's sentient quirk launched itself once more at Izuku, but this time he had no intention of taking the blow himself. Kaken. Flashbang. Izuku, well used to protecting himself from Katsumi's diverse array of explosions, merely threw up a dome to preserve his eyesight and launched himself towards a blinded Yaoyorozu. To her credit, the girl got in a couple good swings with her staff, even bereft of her sight. But in the end, her defeat was inevitable. Izuku secured her arms behind her back with the roll of capture tape they were given beforehand. His head snapped towards where he last saw Tokoyami's beast, only to double-take at the sight of Kaken standing over the boy himself, pinning him in place with a booted foot. Her palm flickered with the embers of an explosion, waiting to detonate as a diminutive version of the once colossal shadow cringed against its host's chest. Izuku breathed a heavy sigh of relief. Tokoyami was down for the count, And that should mean the villain team has been captured. Hero Team WINNSSSSS. Chapter 11. School Days. Izuku. You, Midoriya. What the hell was that, man? Kirishima cried the minute the four combatants returned to the observation room. I don't know you very well, but for some reason that seemed to be typical for you, Katsumi-chan Kero. Izuku laughed while Katsumi growled unintelligibly. Izuku didn't know Azui that well either, but he couldn't help but grin at the accurate assessment of his girlfriend. Take me for a ride sometime too. K. Midoriya? He really hoped Hagakure was talking about his board. Back the fuck up, Invisalign. We don't got time for this shit. Katsumi growled. She stalked back to her place in the observation room, dragging him along by the wrist. Teacher, damn class, all might. The hero's slightly affronted reaction was hilarious enough. But, was Kaken getting territorial? He had to be imagining things, right? As absurd as the thought was, Izuku couldn't help but indulge in the fantasy for a while. All Might coughed lightly into a brick-sized fist, obviously trying to settle his nerves. The juxtaposition was oddly endearing, not detracting at all from the feeling of protection he exuded. Indeed, young Bakugo, and well done, all of you. That was a wonderful first showing. The four of them all nodded severely, still amped up from the action minutes earlier. All Might propped his hands on his hips. Now, can anyone tell me who the MVP might be from this operation? Anyone? For a moment they were silent, each student looking to the others for an answer. So Izuku decided to speak up. It's gotta be Yaoyorozu, right? Katsumi's scowl was venomous. Huh. The fuck you mean her? Deku? We kicked fucking ass. She was predictably pissed as hell, but thinking about it objectively, the reasoning was obvious. We won because we were superior fighters, he said simply. If we were judging based on planning and foresight, or the spirit of the scenario, the choice is obvious. He turned to the black-haired girl across the room. Yaoyorozu, you'd booby-trapped both doors to that room, right? She nodded sharply. And all the major choke points of the building. Blind corners. Oh, and the stairwell. Shit, they really had lucked out. Yaoyorozu-san helped shroud the room in darkness as well, creating blackout curtains for all the windows, Tokoyami said gruffly. Were it not for her aid, I fear Dark Shadow would not have stood a chance against the might of Midoriya's quirk. So that's what his quirk was called. Fitting. But you both saw right through all my preparations. Yaoyorozu said, frowning in obvious frustration. You just skipped right past the building, and came through the roof. How did you get up there so quickly anyway? Girl, Midoriya can surf on his quirk, and it's kinda rad, Jiro said. The rocker chick gave him a sidelong glance, twirling one of her earphone jacks slowly around a finger. Izuku really hoped that wasn't the sound of Kaken's teeth cracking to his right. As much as he usually tried to avoid incidents where Katsumi committed mass murder, he had to admit the attention was incredibly flattering. Don't get him wrong, Izuku doubted his feelings for his best friend would ever change. But such open admiration from his peers was an entirely new experience for him. He couldn't help but enjoy having his ego stroked a bit. He felt his grin widen involuntarily as Katsumi shifted ever so slightly closer to him, just enough to brush their forearms together. Oh my god, it's finally happened. Uraraka hissed suddenly, those closest to the girl turning to her curiously, but her eyes were locked firmly on him. Or more specifically, he and Kaken. Maybe they could have been a little more subtle. Luckily, the girl had enough tact to wave off the inquiries as to what she'd meant, limiting herself to bobbing in place happily. Izuku had to remember to thank her later. It wasn't that he was ashamed of the recent changes. In fact, a part of him wanted to shout it from the rooftops, but another, more rational part really wanted to take things slowly and get this right the first time around. That could all come later though. Yaoyorozu was still stewing self-consciously on what she perceived as her own failure. To put it bluntly, we got lucky, he said to the frowning girl. She met his eyes while the others in the class were once again attentive to what he had to say. How strange. Kaken and I picked a spot at random. Sure, we narrowed down the choices to somewhere out of the sun, but dropping past all the defenses you created was just dumb luck. He shrugged a bit self-consciously. I'm not saying we would have lost. Fat fucking chance. But your decisions weren't incorrect, you know? I see. Yaoyorozu said thoughtfully. She nodded sharply, seeming to have gained a bit of her confidence back. She'd have to work on that. Despite clearly being more than competent in heroics, the beauty certainly didn't have the ego to match. Most of the time that was a good thing. But there were certainly situations where a bit of bravado couldn't hurt. Izuku grinned inwardly, chancing another glance towards Katsumi. He quite liked a bit of bravado in a girl. Well put, Midoriya-kun. Yairose's forethought was indeed impressive, despite the situation not panning out as she'd planned. All Might boomed, with a smile. But I urge you not to shortchange the worth of pure combat prowess. He clenched a mighty fist before his shadowed eyes. The powers wielded by evil in this court society of ours are insidious and ever-changing. Be sure to never rule out a possibility before you've confirmed it for yourself, he said, meeting the eyes of the Yaoyorozu. And as for you, Midoriya-kun and Bakugo-chan, a bit more forethought wouldn't go amiss, all right? Understood, sir. Izuku snapped out reflexively. The man simply commanded that much respect. Yeah, whatever, All Might. Well, most of the time. Now then, the next hero team will be Katsumi. The biting scent of soy sauce and ginger filled the air as Katsumi deftly tossed a sizzling wok filled with the beginnings of her dinner. She was by no means an expert cook, but the few dishes she did know how to make usually turned out okay. The Heights Alliance dorm building certainly hadn't skimped on the more luxurious aspects of temporary housing. The kitchen was fully stocked, and large enough to cook enough for the entire dorm at once. Something smells so good. Fuck off, Pinky. Get your own. Come on, Kasumi. Aren't we friends? Fuck no. The nerd forcing her to make enough for round face 2 was already pushing it. Katsumi had no obligation to cook for the rest of her new classmates. No matter how unsettling it was when they didn't fuck off when she told them to. That was just plain weird. Right. So does the number of tagged objects affect how difficult it is to maintain the weightlessness? Or is it more of a hard cap at a certain mass? Her eyes snapped over to where the nerd in question sat with Uraraka. Deku was finally getting a chance to nerd out to his heart's content, so Katsumi would suffer through the peppy girl's company for one meal. Well, I've made plenty of stuffed animals float at once, Uraraka said, laughing bashfully. But I could only manage a couple of the 2-pointers from the exam, and the 3-pointers I had to take on one by one. So a hard cap then. Deku nodded, scribbling into a familiar-looking notebook. I assume your limits increased over time? Uraraka nodded with pinched eyebrows. Have you ever tested any correlation between physical fitness and your upper limit? The brunette shook her head. I've spent the most time trying to float myself for longer periods. Her expression sagged, and it really didn't suit the girl. It hasn't gone very well. Katsumi knew that fucking look in the nerd's eye. That's probably your best bet, he mused, leaning back with his hands behind his head. Katsumi tried desperately to ignore the way his shirt strained against the muscle of his chest, or the slight peak of shredded abdominals that flashed with his movement. But it was a fruitless effort. Her stirring grew more aggressive as she unknowingly bit her bottom lip. Have you ever isolated the cause of your nausea? He said after a moment of thought. Katsumi had never thought anyone could make confusion look adorable, but Round Face somehow managed it. I don't follow. I get sick from overusing my quirk. Well, yes, that is true, but most of the time it isn't the whole truth. Take Haken for example. Deku glanced her way. She can get headaches from overusing her quirk. Don't fucking tell people that shit, nerd. But it's not really some supernatural force giving her headaches, just the body's natural response to sweating more than the liquid you consume. It's just dehydration. Was he fucking ignoring her? She eyed her walk, trying to focus on the conversation and dinner at the same time. The pink one slid dangerously close to the nerd at their dorm's common room table. Wow, you're like some quirk superguru. Was Pinky trying to die? Katsumi's wooden spoon had come dangerously close to snapping in that moment. But her ire settled in the next as she observed the nerd's response. At least Izuku had the decency to look uncomfortable. Katsumi nearly snorted at the pleading looks he shot her from across the room. She'd never tire of seeing him so flustered. Even if she preferred to cause it herself, maybe this wouldn't be so bad. As long as these bitches knew Deku was hers, why not let him drown in the attention for a while? Hardly. Izuku eventually laughed. I've been cataloging quirks since, well, He shot a tender glance Katsumi's way that totally didn't make her weak in the knees. Since as long as I can remember, Uraraka was kind enough to answer some questions I had about her quirk. I was, actually pretty curious about yours as well, Ishido-san. If you don't mind, that is. Katsumi huffed, tossing in a bowl of leftover rice from the night before into her wok, taking out her aggression as she chopped it all together. At least making fried rice let her zone out to her heart's content. The girl hesitated for a moment, and Katsumi recognized a flash of a familiar emotion in her startling yellow eyes. Katsumi wasn't quite sure what possessed her to speak up, but she felt a need to clarify his request. Deck'll have asked our entire class about their quirks by the end of the week, Pinky. He's not singling you out or anything. The horn girl seemed startled by Katsumi's words, but regained some of her pep a moment later. Right. So, what do you want to know? She said, grinning mischievously. Izuku mused, tapping a pencil against the tabletop. Might want to start with some basic information. I got a good look at everyone's quirks during All Might's battle training today, but it'd probably be best to make sure I wasn't off on anything. Alrighty then. The name's Ishido Mina, and my 3 sizes are… Not that info, Pinky. Ahihi. Just kidding. Oh, are we doing introductions? Me next. Me next. Katsumi's eyes snapped to the shitty-haired guy from her class as he strolled in through the hall leading to the boys' rooms. As his entrance seemed to start an avalanche of people entering from both sides of the dorms, Katsumi kissed her last chances at a peaceful evening goodbye. At least Izuku seemed to be in heaven, surrounded by so many people willing to tell him about their quirks. Hey, Bakugo, you making dinner? Fuck off, Pikachu. Izuku, think you're hot shit now, huh, Deku? Katsumi's breath ghosted across his collarbone, while her feathery spikes of hair tickled the underside of his jaw. But any thought of that was quickly driven out of his mind as the girl's lips parted, sucking lightly on the sensitive skin of his neck. Izuku gulped thickly. Where the hell had this come from? Not that he was complaining or anything, but he was having trouble understanding how the blushing Kaken from the night before had somehow been replaced by this devilish seductress in a single day. Any further pondering on the matter quickly seemed irrelevant as Katsumi slowly trailed up the side of his jaw, peppering gentle kisses all the way. However, the girl mercilessly hesitated as she reached the corner of his mouth, staring challengingly up into his eyes. Izuku had headed off to bed with fingers sore from writing so much in one sitting, but content with the info he'd gathered on his new peers, only to be pinned almost immediately to his door the minute he set foot in his room. The fiery blonde had wasted no time in her lustful assault. Izuku pushed the last of those thoughts out of his head, instead choosing to close the final few centimeters between them, claiming her lips for the 3rd time in 2 days. But there was something noticeably different about this particular encounter. A mutual understanding had been reached. It gave way to a fervor between them in that moment that was distinctly absent from before. Gone were the lingering thoughts of miscommunication. Absent was the fear of ruined friendships. And this time he was sure it wasn't simply a dream manifesting his deepest desires. It all left Izuku free to enjoy the simple softness of Kaken's pale lips dancing with his own, or the feminine curves of her toned figure lying deliciously flush with the hard planes of his chest. Izuku caressed the curve of her spine, slipping his fingertips under the loosened blouse of her UA uniform, ghosting over the prominent swell of her rear. His jaw nearly dropped open at the spine-tingling whimper that Kaken let out into his mouth. He'd never heard her make that noise before, but he was certain of one thing. He definitely wanted to hear it again. But all thought of going on the offensive went out the window as Katsumi aggressively ground her pelvis against his own. Even over their clothes, the delicious friction earned nearly an instant response from his already throbbing member. His resolution to take things slowly was rapidly crumbling before his eyes, and she fucking knew it too. "Katsumi," he choked out between kisses. "What's wrong, nerd?" she hissed out, continuing her slow grinding. "There a fucking problem," she taunted with each thrust forward. The door rattled with their motion, the animalistic dry humping they devolved to reaching a fever pitch. Izuku finally caved, grabbing 2 handfuls of the ass he'd been tempted by for years, and aided her desperate rutting. Katsumi clamped her powerful legs around his hips, increasing the pace even further while still tangling their tongues madly. A familiar feeling built at the base of his groin, but with an intensity he'd never managed to reach himself. It was no wonder, considering his absolute seductress of a best friend was the cause rather than his own hand. Katsumi, don't you dare fucking stop, Izuku? God. Stopping was the last thing on his mind. His grip on her pliable rear tightened as he forcibly ground her core against his own, hoping for all that was good in the world that Katsumi was as close to release as he was. The layers of clothes between them were uncomfortable at first, but they could only prevent the stimulation so much, and Izuku felt himself nearing his limit. Luckily, Katsumi seemed just as close. Just a little. No. Her whole body tensed, powerful legs nearly crushing his waist as she vibrated at the intensity of what he hoped was her own release. Izuku barely got a chance to appreciate the image of Katsumi's head thrown back in the midst of a powerful orgasm as he too plummeted over the edge. Pulsating waves of purely physical euphoria washed over him as his member erupted. It was, frankly, the most intense feeling he'd ever experienced. And that was over their clothes. It could have been minutes or hours that Izuku was immersed in the throes of pleasure, and understandably, found himself lost for words. He trailed off, language coming up lacking to describe what had just occurred. Katsumi panted heavily, breath tickling his neck where she buried her face throughout her release. In fact, she hadn't moved at all since then, legs seemingly permanently locked around his waist, and his hands still supporting her bottom. For a moment they didn't move, basking in the afterglow of finally releasing at least a drop of years of sexual tension. But even coming off the back of such an act, Izuku could already feel the stirrings of renewed lust for this succubus before him. The way she started wiggling her hips around in his hands wasn't helping matters, but her next words served to break his spell. "Those pants are fucked." The dam broke and Katsumi and he both collapsed into gales of laughter. Izuku slid down the door, keeping the smaller girl clutched in his arms. The uncomfortable sticky feeling from his groin only served to set him off again, wheezing as he tried to catch his breath. "Shit," Katsumi cursed quietly. "What is it?" She could only avoid his gaze so well, straddling his lap as she was. "I burnt your shirt." His eyes widened in surprise, glancing over his shoulder to where she'd been clutching his back moments earlier. He'd felt the sting in the back of his mind, but had just thought she'd gotten a bit aggressive with her grip. Sure enough, the white material of his uniform shirt was blackened and charred through in two distinctly palm-sized patches. To think that he'd driven her to the point of losing control of her quirk. He couldn't help the warm rush of pride at that. "Wipe that fucking smirk off your face, nerd," she bit out. But the brilliant flush that lit up her face ruined any intimidation factor she may have had going for her. His grin widened. "I've reviewed the footage from battle training yesterday, Aizawa drawled. Your overall performances were acceptable." The class let out a collective sigh of relief. At least they wouldn't put some absurd test based on the results. However, they tensed up once more. "You'll need to come to a consensus on a class president." "That's a totally normal school activity," cried some of the more outspoken students. "I want to be president. Let me do it," Kirishima said, jumping excitedly. "The position was made for me," Aoyama twinkled. "I'd like to do it too. I want to be a leader. In my administration, girls will have to show at least 30 centimeters of thigh." Izuku's eyebrow twitched in annoyance. Mina's comments were questionable before, but it was a bit more personal now that he was actually involved with one of the women the miniature hero student spoke of so carelessly. There were several prime choices for class president in Izuku's opinion. Ida was practically built for the role, and with a bit more confidence, Yaoyorozu would probably succeed as well. But as long as Mineta wasn't elected, he could probably live with whoever was. Leading the mini is a task of heavy responsibility, but simply wanting the role is not enough. The class quieted down as Ida lectured them all, but Izuku grinned seeing the boy's hand remaining ramrod straight in the air. He must really want the role. "Dude, what are you talking about?" Kaminari snickered. Ida adjusted his glasses severely with his other hand. "If this is to be a democracy, then I put forward the motion that our true leader must be chosen by election." Izuku nodded thoughtfully. There's merit to the idea. But won't everyone just vote for themselves? Mina asked curiously. For someone to receive more than a single vote from their peers simply means that they were that deserving of the role. Sensei, will you allow it? Ida snapped a flattened arm towards Aizawa. Do what you want, just make it quick. Kaken turned to stare him down from her seat one ahead of his. No. He's the best for the job. Deku. Do you even want to be the class rep? I ain't gonna be subservient to engines, she said, tone dripping with disdain. Like the job comes with that kind of authority, Izuku laughed. Look, if you don't want Ida to be class rep, then you can always use your vote on someone else. The look she gave him was particularly unamused, and yet still managed to set his heart racing. The downright aggressive way she'd come on to him the previous night was still fresh on his mind. He had no idea what had gotten into Kaken, but it certainly wasn't an unwelcome change. Oi nerd. Izuku broke out of his thoughts with a flush, meeting Kaken's narrowed gaze. She held out a strip of paper that he was meant to vote on. Quit spassin' out, she said softly. She glanced away in an attempt to remain aloof, but Izuku caught the hint of a flush, dusting her cheeks as well. Use your vote for someone else? The fuck did I listen to such shitty advice? Katsumi grumbled, stabbing her lunch aggressively. How was I supposed to know so many people would vote for me? Izuku asked rhetorically. I didn't even vote for me. Somehow, Izuku had been voted class president, with Yaoyorozu his deputy, much to the obvious ire of his girlfriend. God, that was such a weird way to think of Kaken. It was technically accurate, but just seemed so flat. A title that represented merely the tip of the iceberg that was their relationship. Did an added sexual attraction really invalidate nearly a decade of genuine friendship? That didn't sound right to Izuku. Katsumi-chan's just jealous, Kero. Go to hell, Kermit. Azui remained impressively unflinching in the face of Katsumi's retort. I only say what's on my mind. They decided to eat in the dining hall that day, giving Izuku the first look at the full scope UA's attendees. Since only the two classes dedicated to the hero course were housed in dorms, they never spent any significant time with the rest of the first years. The various classes tended to stick together to different degrees. The business students sat packed tightly together into the 4 tables in the corner closest to the exits, while support and general ed were interspersed throughout the center of the room. Izuku and Kastomi had claimed the table closest to the kitchen, where he could properly observe pro-hero lunch rush work as magic. Kaken sat with mild exasperation as he scribbled notes on the pro. But Izuku had a feeling he could watch the man for years and never truly understand his culinary genius. The way he almost single-handedly served 5-star meals to hundreds of students without even breaking a sweat was almost like magic. They'd been joined by Uraraka, Azui, and Ida a couple minutes later. I, for one, think you will be a wonderful class president, Midoriya. I knew that the minute you rushed in without hesitation to take on that monstrosity in the entrance exam. Sounds fucking familiar. I agree, Midoriya-kun, Azui croaked. Your performance in All Might's battle training was a show for sure. Oh, you mean in the pair battles? Kaken cut in once more. Besides, Katsumi-chan probably has no problem with Izuku being president, Uraraka added with a devious smile. I think it's the vice-pres that she's worried about. She giggled, dodging Kaken's retaliatory swipe like a pro. I'm surprised you voted for someone else so easily, Ida-kun, Azui said, touching a single finger to her mouth in thought. Didn't you want the job yourself? Kero. Yeah. You've got the glasses and everything? Uraraka said earnestly. The fuck does that have to do with anything? Ida straightened up, primly wiping his mouth with a napkin. I humbly made the choice I felt was correct. Izuku nodded in understanding, acknowledging the show of trust from the taller boy. The taller boy's formal manner of speech reminded Izuku of something he'd been curious about. Ida, I've been wondering for a while now. Your quirk, I've seen another like it before in my hero studies. You wouldn't happen to be related to Ingenium, would you? The studious boy heaved a sigh. Quite astute of you, Midoriya-kun. I had hoped to avoid being treated any differently than my peers just because of my family, but you are indeed correct. My brother is the latest of a long line of prestigious heroes to hold the Ida name, commanding over 60 sidekicks in his agency alone, the turbo hero Ingenium. If Ida exuded any more pride for his brother, he'd be nearing Kaken levels, but it was inspiring in a way. Izuku knew better than anyone that a role model did wonders for a prospective hero's progress. Izuku didn't get any more time to bask in Ida's praise though, as a shrieking alarm began blaring over every loudspeaker in the building. The dining hall erupted in chaos as students haphazardly scrambled towards the nearest exit, heedless of those that stood in their path. Izuku latched a steely grip on the jacket of a nearby third year, halting him at his tracks. "What's going on? What does that alarm mean?" "There's been a breach on the campus. It's never happened before since I've been here." He slacked his grip, letting the panicking boy go free, and instantly began wading his way through the crowd towards Katsumi. To his surprise, the girl was bodying her way through the crowd with Uraraka tucked safely to her side. Apparently, she'd grown more fond of the brunette than he'd thought. "The fuck is going on, nerd?" she growled. "Someone breached the security system," he shouted over the alarms still blaring in their ears. She elbowed a second year out of the way after the poor guy bumped into her. "Prestigious university, my ass. They ever hear of a fucking fire drill?" He couldn't help but agree. Even now he saw some of the smaller students nearly be trampled under the panicking crowd. His eyes darted around, looking for something, anything, that could help calm the mob of students. Midoriya-kun. His eyes snapped to Ida, who had somehow ended up flattened against the glass of the nearest window. "It's the press. There is no danger." "Oh, well, that made things a bit easier." Without pausing to consider the consequences, he quickly scooped Kaken up into a bridal carry before using his quirk to glide them above the crowd. "Put me the fuck down, Deku!" she raged through an adorable flush, pounding a fist against his chest. He'd have to do this more often if that's the reaction he got. "Can you draw their attention?" he asked, ignoring her indignant shout. She immediately grasped what he was getting at. After giving him a moment to plug his ears with a tiny amount of quicksteel, she let loose a deafening blast that immediately silenced the surging crowd. Eyes raised to his position as people quickly located the source of the noise. "You're acting like a bunch of children," Izuku said simply, his voice carrying to the very back of the room despite his conversational tone. Multiple sets of eyes widened as they took in the sight of Izuku levitating so casually above their heads. He also picked out Class 1A specifically, whose reactions carried a bit more levity for some reason. The reaction confused him for a moment before he realized he was still carrying Kaken like a bride on her wedding night. Oh well, at least it wasn't really a misunderstanding this time. Having her draped in his arms like this wasn't exactly unpleasant. Izuku cleared his throat trying to regain his composure. "There's no danger," he stated, nodding towards the window where Ida still stood, stiffly gesturing outside like some sort of traffic control officer. "It's just the press trying to get in again. I suggest you continue to your homeroom teachers in an orderly fashion. No need to crush your classmates." Luckily, as with most things in life, once the problem itself was identified, it could be addressed with a calm head. Order soon returned, and the students proceeded through the marked exits without the stampeded mentality of moments earlier. "Deku," came an ominous growl from the girl in his hands. Oops. Well, at least she'd have to wait for him to put her down before she could kick his ass. He took his sweet time gliding them back to the ground, and it was totally worth it. Katsumi. Oh my god, it was like so romantic. Invisalign and Pinky hadn't shut up about it since the previous day, and to add insult to injury, Katsumi had been stuck doing present mixed shitty English essay all night. That meant she'd had no real opportunity to punish the nerd for pulling that shit yesterday. Katsumi bit out a curse as she felt an increasingly familiar heat creep onto her cheeks. How the hell did just the thought of being cradled in his powerful arms make her light up like a fucking tomato? Sure, it was in front of all the extras, but with what had happened just 2 nights ago, why was this affecting her so much? "I wish Midoriya would sweep me off my feet. I'm not some shitty princess, Pinky," she hissed at the girl. Katsumi was about to come over there and let the girl know what she really thought of her, but halted at the pressure of a hand settling at her side. Thoughts of pummeling the pink one were shoved to the wayside in favor of dealing with the fucking goosebumps that erupted over her flesh with a single touch from the nerd. Romance was fucking bullshit. "Settle down, class." Aizawa sighed through his seemingly never-ending exhaustion. Katsumi inwardly grinned at the unnecessary intro. The extras were scared shitless of their sensei after that shit he pulled on the first day. Even she was hesitant to earn the man's ire. For today's basic hero training, you'll have a trio of instructors. We'll be meeting All Might and one other at different location. Sensei, where are we going? Woohoo, a field trip already? Did this dumb motherfucker really just say that? Did they learn nothing from the first day? Correct. We'll be going to USJ. Wait, what the fuck? He means the unforeseen simulation joint, Kaken. Then why the fuck didn't he say that then? She hissed back. Katsumi froze as Aizawa rolled a single lazy eye in her direction, and for a second, she thought she might have to dodge a flying scarf. But he turned away with a yawn the next moment. Phew. Well-researched, Midoriya. We'll be focusing on rescue drills for today. But the facility is a bit out of the way, so you're all taking a bus. Whoa, it really is a field trip? Rescue? Huh. Sounds like another rough day. Come on, guys. This is what being a hero's all about. Well, Shitty Hair had a point with that one. It was a sentiment Katsumi might not have taken seriously at a certain point in her life, but she'd long since adjusted her stance. She had a feeling the changes could be attributed solely to a certain hero nerd. Oh right. Aizawa clicked a handheld device, opening their hero gear lockers. Some of you may elect to not wear your costumes as they'd be more of a hindrance than a help for rescue operations, but other than that, it's up to you. Katsumi had a feeling that first comment may have been aimed at her, but that was merely Aizawa's assumption. She long since refined her quirk to limit collateral damage. Who do you think the other teacher's gonna be? Izuku asked with honest joy in his eyes. She hid a smile in her sleeve. How should I know? Deku? He was such a fucking dork. Izuku. They'd been in the UA bus for nearly 20 minutes, reminding Izuku of the epic view he'd glimpsed during the entrance exam. But seeing the sprawling planes passing them by in the windows of the luxurious travel bus gave them a more tangible measure of UA's scale. It made him want to fly. He'd never been able to soar freely without a particular goal in mind. Restrictions of public quirk usage limited what he could do as a child. And whenever he had used it in the past, it had been for training or in more urgent situations. But as a student at UA, maybe he could get away with traveling if he ever got a day to himself. Izuku loved skating the streets of Mizutafu for the sport of it. He had a feeling that exploring the skies would be just as captivating. Midoriya-kun. Izuku abandoned his cloud watching, turning back to look over the seat in front of him. Azui had her elbows propped on the back of her seat while her hands cradled her face, which, in his opinion, was arguably rounder than Uraraka's. Her eyes were a green so dark that in the right light they appeared black, wide, and unblinking. What is it, Azui-san? Call me Tsuyu, Karo. All right, Tsuyu then. Spit it out, frog for brains, Katsumi said cuttingly from his side. Izuku, acting on impulse, pinched her rear out of sight of the other students, earning a yelp and a deathly scowl for his trouble. Oh well, she'd just have to learn to play nice. Or at least not be rude for no reason. It's fine, Midoriya. I tend to say what's on my mind as well. Wait, did she just? You've been quite outspoken about your fascination with our quirks, but we know next to nothing about yours, Tsuyu said, touching a finger to her lips in thought. Yeah, I've been totally curious too. Kirishima cut in as he zipped over from his spot on the bench seats. We've seen you toss a softball into the next prefecture. Keep pace with the kid with engines in his calves. Oh, and that's right, Fly. You can fly, Midoriya. Not to mention you held up against Tokoyami's dark shadow quite effortlessly, Yaoyorozu said from the seat behind him. Our backup strategy heavily relied on its power in such a favorable environment, but it seems we underestimated you after all, Midoriya-kun. I too admit myself curious to the source of Midoriya's power, Tokoyami added from across the aisle. Izuku was slightly overwhelmed at all the sudden attention. Was this what Kaken had dealt with for all those years? Judging from the tiny smirk he caught out of the side of his vision, she was enjoying the swapped roles immensely. I've been meaning to ask. Uraraka said from her seat beside Yaoyorozu, peering around the bus curiously. Where is it? There was a brief pause before. You're right, said Hagakure's disembodied voice. Your quirk's gone, Midoriya. Can you make it disappear too? It's hardly that convenient, Izuku laughed. He pointed a single finger towards the roof of the bus. It's above us. Wha? Seriously? Jiro said lightly, clearly eavesdropping on the conversation. Izuku shrugged. It's more for convenience than anything. When I was a kid, Quicksteel was around the size of a grapefruit. It must have been so cute. He was about to mention to Uraraka that it was an inanimate mass of metal, but changed his mind a second later. In the early days of his youth, Quicksteel indeed seemed to have a mind of its own, whizzing around every which way without any conscious decision on his part. Well, I'm not sure, but nowadays, I try to be considerate on the rare occasion I do take public transportation. Izuku willed his quirk down to where it was visible through the windows of the bus. It effortlessly kept up with the speed of the vehicle, humming through the air like a silver comet trailed by a double helix tail. Those closest to the windows peered out in awe while others craned their necks to get a better view. "Show off," Katsumi whispered by his side, but she was grinning even more widely by this point. "Kua, I'm so freaking jealous, Midoriya," Kirishima cried. "That sort of flashy quirk is awesome. You can totally do a bunch of cool stuff with it." He stuck out his arm, which grew jagged and noticeably rock-like, but curiously still retained the same healthy skin tone. "My hardening's good in a fight, but it's so boring," he said realistically. "That's right. Don't forget that heroes also have to worry about popular appeal," Aoyama said grandly. "My naval laser is both strong and cool, perfect for a pro, as long as you don't blow up your own stomach," Bushido said, immediately crushing his bravado. "Midori is a given, but if you want showy, it'd have to be Bakugo-chan or Todoroki, no?" Tsuyu said frankly. Katsumi scowled at his side, but remarkably stayed silent. Izuku suppressed a grin. Did she think he would pinch her again? "I used to think the same way," Izuku said with a hint of melancholy. "But over the years I found my opinion to have changed slightly." "Really? How so?" Yaoyorozu asked curiously. She seemed to hold a much higher opinion of him, since they clashed briefly in battle training. Or maybe it was his supporting her in the briefing afterwards. "Some quirks are obviously flashier than others," he started, surreptitiously brushing his knuckles against Katsumi's. "But I think a hero's personality means a lot more than their quirk. I can't help but believe that even someone with a quirk like Aizawa-sensei's could be a showboat given the right attitude. Though, whether they'd be able to manage the same level of subterfuge is a different matter." Izuku laughed lightly as Katsumi scoffed, knowing she actually disagreed with him on this point. They'd argued over it constantly as kids. Yaoyorozu was the first brave soul to question Katsumi's reaction. "You disagree, Bakugo-san?" Katsumi eyed the taller girl with a sidelong glance, arms folded tightly under her chest. The cleavage exposed by her black and orange armor was accentuated slightly by the pose. "Disagreeing is exaggerating a bit," she finally bit out. "I just think that sometimes life gives you a shit hand, and you've got to work with what you got. A lot of the time, that leads to people resembling their quirks." Several heads around the bus nodded thoughtfully. Izuku grinned. "So you be short-fused, Todoroki's confused, and what does that make me? A fucking weirdo." The bus erupted in laughter, and for once it was not out of cruelty, but mutual respect. "Enough with all the noise," Aizawa cut in abruptly. "We're here, look alive. Welcome, young zygotes," All Might said as they trailed one by one into the absolute massive structure. To call it a building would be the mother of all understatements. The only reason the unforeseen simulation joint even qualified as a single building was the arching dome that covered the entire area. The complex was divided into several different zones, each clearly meant to represent a different type of natural or man-made disaster. "I thought he was joking about the USJ thing," Bushido whispered. He could understand the sentiment. Even from the entrance, Izuku could pick out both an artificial body of water, as well as a destroyed hillside village he assumed was meant to simulate a landslide. The orange glow of what looked like a flame radiated off in the distance. But that couldn't be right. They wouldn't just set buildings on fire for the sake of a drill, would they? All Might stood grandly at the top step of the long staircase that led down into the main area of the simulation. But something seemed off about the legendary hero. His upward swooping bangs weren't as pristine as usual, and his already shadowed eyes appeared even more so. Was he overworked? Tired? Could All Might even get tired? Izuku shook off the idle thoughts. Now wasn't the time to be worrying about such a thing. Besides, his real focus was on the new, well, not exactly face, but the presence of the pro hero 13 was certainly a welcome surprise. "Oh my god, it's 13, whispered Uraraka. She practically vibrated in place with her excitement. "I'm guessing you're a fan?" Izuku smiled. "Try the biggest fan," she enthused shamelessly. "Welcome to the unforeseen simulation joint," All Might said once they'd all gathered around the three pros. "As much pride as I have in my ability to help those in need, when it comes to evacuation and rescue, my most esteemed colleague here truly has no equal. I'm sure you'll treat him with the respect he deserves." All Might bowed out of the way, giving the space hero the floor. "You flatter me, senpai," 13 said, rubbing the back of his head in embarrassment. "Aizawa senpai has informed me that some of you already have an idea of what the USJ is, but for those of you that don't, I'll briefly explain." The class collectively sat attentively, captivated by the rescue hero's polite demeanor. "There's the flood zone, the landslide zone, the conflagration zone, etc. Every disaster or accident you can imagine, and even some you might not. The USJ is a facility of my own design for the sole purpose of preparing the future generation of heroes for such catastrophes, and today you'll all get to experience it firsthand." They clapped uproariously once the space-suit-clad hero had finished his explanation. "Thank you," he said, holding his white-gloved hands up for silence, and earning it immediately. "But before we begin, I have 1 or 2 points to make. Well, maybe 3. No, for I've got lots of points." Izuku suppressed a snicker under his breath. For such a reliable hero, 13 was kind of an airhead when he wasn't in the zone. He couldn't help but make the comparison to the enthusiastic brunette standing to his left. Uraraka bounced on the balls of her feet as she stood enraptured by the space hero's speech. "As I'm sure many of you are aware, my quirk is called Black Hole, and is capable of sucking in and destroying any material." Izuku repressed a shudder at the thought. Having the tether that granted him control of Quick Steel Cut by Aizawa's erasure was an experience he never wished to repeat. But 13's quirk. Could the pro destroy Izuku's quirk altogether? Would there be any way to get it back? Why were his sensei so terrifying? "You've used it to save thousands of people," Uraraka said, unable to contain her excitement. But it was cut down a moment later. "That's correct, however, without restraint, my power could easily dwarf the damage caused by the disasters I work to prevent. I could kill, and it would be effortless." They all remained silent, processing the critical lesson. "I see that some of you have realized that you're in a similar situation, if not quite on the scale of my own quirk. In our superpowered society, the use of quirks is heavily restricted and monitored." "You got that fucking right," Katsumi whispered. "The system may seem like a stable one, but we must never forget that all it takes is one wrong move with an uncontrollable quirk for people to die." The hero paused, recollecting himself after broaching such a sensitive topic. "In Aizawa Senpai's standardized fitness test you established your physical limits, while in All Might's battle training you gained experience using your quirk in a more practical combat situation." He spread his arms widely, the vast expanse of the USJ serving as a backdrop to the space hero's silhouette. "This class, however, will show you a new perspective. You'll learn how to utilize your quirks to save lives. Your powers are not meant to inflict harm, and at the end of the day, being a hero is about helping others. I hope you leave here today with a better understanding of that fact. Thank you." He gave a short little bow, and the class erupted into applause, Izuku clapping alongside the rest of his peers. 13 certainly had a way with words. You really got a sense of the maturity he held, a quality that was practically mandatory with such a destructive quirk at his disposal. Wonderful. An excellent sentiment to live by, 13-kun. Now, All Might paused mid-sentence, his near-permanent smile dimming slightly as he peered around the USJ in concern. Something was wrong. There was an odd distortion in the air, barely recognized by the sensory nature of his quick steel. But it was still there, and was growing stronger by the second. "Kaken, we need to get..." But he never had a chance to finish his warning. The vibration in the air reached a fever pitch, and a swirling vortex of pure darkness burst into existence over the central plaza of the USJ. The massless shadows licked at the ground around the central fountain before it seemed to solidify into a vaguely ovular shape, still swirling with ominous black and purple tendrils. A slender, pale hand reached slowly through the void. Chapter 12. Izuku. Izuku had had a small taste of the danger heroes faced on a daily basis. The sludge villain from all those months ago had cemented that idea firmly in his mind, relatively early in his hero career. But as the slender man with severed hands cradling his body stepped out of the swirling darkness with a small army at his back, Izuku had a hunch that this situation may be of an entirely different scale. They had a warped quirk on their side, for crying out loud. What's going on? Kirishima asked, peering down at the swirling darkness. I thought we were doing rescue training today? Get back, Aizawa shouted, throwing a hand out to block the redhead from taking another step forward. This isn't an exercise. He pulled a pair of slotted goggles up from under his scarf, snapping them into place over bloodshot eyes. Even having a vague idea of their sensei's abilities, Izuku was still somewhat astonished at the change that overcame the normally lethargic hero. Dark brows furrowed in concentration as the man assessed the threat to his students. The final villain stepped through the portal, a hulking monstrosity, standing several feet taller than its nearest companions. The contents of its grotesque, avian-like head were open to the elements. Even from the top of the stairs, its fleshy, unnaturally pink brain matter was visible. The swirling void shimmered, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid shape, though it still writhed around the edges, formed shadowy and indistinct. Eraserhead, 13, and of course, the symbol of peace himself. It seems the information we secured was correct after all, Tamura-kun. The shadowy being's voice was deep and gravelly, though he spoke with an oddly cultured cadence that carried over the distance between the two groups. The other villain in charge, Tamura, if the warped quirk user's words were to be trusted, cracked a bone-chilling grin that was only partially obscured by the severed hand over his face. Ha. It's finally time, Kirojiri. He turned to where they all stood huddled at the top of the stairs. Congratulations, children. You're fortunate enough to witness a truly momentous occasion. The death of your beloved symbol of peace. What? He can't be serious, right? We've been had, Aizawa cursed, his scarf uncoiling ominously. The security breach? It makes sense, but to think it had all been an elaborate plot aimed at myself. But sensei, Yaoyorozu said urgently. Aren't there intruder sensors? They shouldn't have been able to get in without anyone knowing. To be fair, they could be attacking the main campus as well, Todoroki mused in his deep tenor. But if this is an isolated attack, then it's got to be one of their quirks. Kaminari, Izuku said to the electric blonde boy. Does your communicator have a signal? He shook his head with a frown after touching a hand to the device covering one ear. All Might sported more of a grimace than a smile by this point. Children, please follow every direction young 13 gives you. It seems you'll be the rescued rather than the rescuers today. Eraserhead. Yeah. I'll keep the fodder off your back. Wait up a second. Mineta cried in fear. You can't just leave us. Didn't you fucking hear him? Grape drink? They're doing the opposite, Katsumi hissed. Her eyes narrowed dangerously down onto the plaza. Izuku knew she wanted to stay and fight, and he couldn't help but feel the same way. Leaving the heroes, no matter who they were, to handle the situation alone left a bitter taste in his mouth. But whether they could hold their own against the villains or not, Izuku knew that their sensei would never let them endanger themselves, not so early into the school year. But still, Eraserhead, Izuku sighed heavily. I won't insult you by suggesting you couldn't handle these guys by yourself, but you have to know that they wouldn't come this far without a plan. Izuku turned to All Might. I'm sure people have tried to kill you before, but with how effective their plan has been up to this point. He trailed off, letting them follow his train of thought for themselves. I understand the sentiment, Midoriya Shonen. The massive hand that All Might planted on Izuku's shoulder might have shattered the spine of a lesser human. But have no fear. As you've said yourself, this is not the first time evildoers have come for my head. All Might paused, glowering down at the amassed army. But it is the first time they've endangered my students in the process. Izuku had the odd urge to laugh despite the situation as several of the villains took a few unsteady steps back. His eyes only shot even wider as Aizawa-sensei, though he was acting as Eraserhead in this moment, practically flew down the stairs towards the gathering of villains. All Might followed, clearing the gap in a single leap, crashing to a stop before the amassed army. "Come this way, everyone," 13 said with a level head. "Stay alert. We don't know if those in the plaza are the only villains here." Izuku spared one final look, seeing Aizawa fling around the first wave of villains like ragdolls, as All Might traded a few words with what looked like the leader. "Looks like Shitty Eraser knows what he's doing, huh?" Izuku turned to see Kaken at his side, glaring down at their sensei. They may have been uncoordinated thugs, but seeing Aizawa single-handedly isolate and dismantle the assembled villains by ones and twos with his personal style of martial arts was certainly a sight to see. But those three villains in the back had Izuku hesitating to flee with his classmates. The hulking, indigo-skinned monster in particular had his hair standing on end. The beastly villain stood so still Izuku might have mistaken for a statue, were it not so grotesquely intimidating. "You, Midoriya, Bakugo, let's go. Aizawa and All Might can handle it." Izuku turned to respond, only to narrow his eyes as that same distortion as before tingled his quirk. "Kirishima, get back." The swirling mass of darkness appeared nearly instantly before them. Two glowing yellow eyes came into being centered over a metallic collar-like chassis. Its form became vaguely humanoid once more. Izuku noted the speed at which the villain teleported this time. It was so much faster than when he'd transported the army below. Was it because he was only moving himself? Or maybe the distance? "Greetings," the being said conversationally in that same cultured tone. He loomed over their class and 13 ominously. "We are the League of Villains. Forgive our audacity, but today, we've come here to UA, this bastion of heroism, to end the life of All Might, the symbol of peace." Katsumi had moved before he could tell her otherwise, blast jumping to the perfect angle where she could unleash a blazing roundhouse directly at the being's collar. Kirishima, seeing the girl's assault, had followed with a hardened right straight a moment later. Izuku bit out a curse. There was of course merit in a surprise attack, but he didn't like the chances of being able to damage that intangible body. Curiously, the villain visibly ducked her kick, with Kirishima's reckless punch passing harmlessly through its torso. That he'd expected, but with the way the villain had purposefully avoided the first blow. Maybe that collar was more than it seemed. Izuku coiled a tendril of quick steel around each of his classmates, attempting to yank them out of harm's way. But it was a fruitless effort as the void opened once more, swallowing the pair, along with a good portion of his quick steel. Izuku vaguely heard the shouts of the rest of his classmates as they too were consumed by the void, but his gaze was mostly locked on the villain's first two victims. It may have been the prospect of fighting without his quirk at full power, or perhaps the defiant terror he'd caught at the last second in Kaken's eyes. But Izuku wasn't quite ready to part ways just yet. He leaped forward in the blink of an eye, ignoring the shouts of 13 and his classmates, and dove headfirst into the void after her. "Katumi. Fucking warped quirks." Katsumi cursed. She unleashed a blistering explosion in a wide arc across the dilapidated rooftop. The wannabe villains scattered before her like the ants they were. "You, Bakugo-chan. You're totally badass and all, but I'm not fireproof over here." The red-headed extra whined from where he'd landed after their unplanned travel through space. "Fuck off, hair for brains," she said bitingly. She really didn't have time to deal with weaklings right now. If this tomato-headed fucker hadn't gotten in her way earlier, she might have had a shot at taking out the villain's only way out of this pathetic assassination attempt. Kill All Might? What a fucking joke. Warped quirks by definition posed a regulation nightmare for obvious reasons. Even in a society of quirked individuals, being able to instantly appear at another location was both incredibly rare and immensely practical. It was an ability coveted and feared by various national governments around the world. But in the hands of a villain organization, Katsumi ducked a telegraph swing from one of the more arrogant criminals. Calling them villains at this point would be an insult to those who actually posed a threat. His fist, armored by some sort of bootleg support gauntlet, whistled over her head. Missing by inches, Katsumi jabbed a clenched fist in his gut, cracking him over the head with an elbow a split second later. The hooded criminal heaved from the power of her blow, crumpling to the ground a moment later. She carelessly kicked his drooling body away from her. Turning to the group of villains, staring them down like they weren't even worthy of polishing her fucking boots. "Who's next then?" she grinned, sparking her palms threateningly. So manly. Katsumi twitched, leveling a glare promising pain at her red-headed classmate. She'd almost forgotten about the last time he'd called her that shit. Did this idiot have a death wish? Unfortunately, the current situation didn't allow any time for pounding the redhead. The villains charged as one this time, letting out a collective war cry of jumbled threats. "Get her. It's just a fucking girl. She can't beat all of us. Rhea, we'll show you what villains do to kids playing hero. Time to die, bitch." Why did this seem so familiar? Katsumi shook off the strange sense of déjà vu to spare her classmate a glance. It would be a pain to have to look after dead weight in a fight, but he seemed to have pulled himself together, standing ready to help, as if she needed it. Even without looking back to the charging villains, Katsumi deftly sidestepped the first swing from the lead fighter, skipping out of the way of the powerful scaled tail that lashed out to follow. Katsumi crouched low, swinging a crushing knee directly into the anthropomorphic alligator's solar plexus. The blow only stunned the thug for a moment, probably due to his mutant quirk granting somewhat thicker skin than most. But it had bought Katsumi enough time to be his undoing. A crackling fist to the face was enough to put him down permanently. The whistling sound of an object speeding through the air was the only warning to the impending danger. Katsumi Blast jumped to dodge the speeding projectiles, her eyes snapping in mid-air to the villain standing at the far end of the rooftop. A ranged quirk? Or was it simply a support weapon? Either way, the projectiles had left deep gouges in the concrete rooftop. Katsumi couldn't quite pick out what was being fired, but avoiding them would probably be her best bet. The sneering villain fired off another salvo which Katsumi parried with an explosion of sizable power. It was a bit of a waste of stamina, but until she knew what exactly she was dealing with, it was best to err on side of safety. Her precaution was rendered unnecessary a moment later when her classmate charged the woman straight out. Katsumi's caustic warning died on her lips as the redhead tanked the next shots with barely a flinch, delivering a powerful haymaker to her head in the next moment. Shit, maybe hardening wasn't as useless as she'd thought. Now that the villain taking pot shots at her was taken care of, Katsumi was free to battle the rest unhindered. Since they'd been deposited in the collapsed zone, the villains surrounding them had been mostly close-ranged fighters with the exception of the one they'd just taken out. Being limited to the rooftop did slightly hamper her mobility, but choosing to fight her in close quarters? Were they insane? 3 fighters converged on her at once, attempting to catch her off balance as she landed from her dodge. But they didn't have a chance. They might as well have been hitting her with wet noodles for all the damage their blows did to her. She parried them all the same, expertly weaving around the attacks as they came, finally putting all her experience brawling with Deku to practical use. The thugs barely posed a threat when compared to the nerd, but it wouldn't do to get into bad habits. Seeing a slight opening in their combined attacks, Katsumi slicked in between the 2 leading villains before flipping over the shoulders of the third. She latched her legs around the villain's neck in a classic triangle choke before letting off an explosion of only concussive force and minor heat directly to his vulnerable head, knocking him out instantly. Katsumi rolled away from the collapsing body, skipping away with a feather-light step. The downed villain's 2 companions attacked with renewed vigor, perhaps in some diluted sense of responsibility. Maybe they were trying to avenge their comrade or something. Did villains even have a code of honor? Katsumi hopped over a leg sweep attempted by the villain on the right, a guy with 4 arms who seemed to have at least some background in martial arts. He predictably tried to grab her while she was airborne and unable to dodge. A tetrabrachial fighter going for a grapple. How original. It might have worked, had she been any ordinary student. However, assuming Katsumi couldn't maneuver in mid-air was the height of ignorance. It was where she thrived. Katsumi tucked her knees towards her chest, curling in tightly before unleashing an explosionated sideways donkey kick directly into the villain's exposed chest. She really hoped that snap she'd heard hadn't been any more than a fractured rib. Even under the threat of a villain attack, accidentally killing someone would only bring more trouble down the line. It wouldn't do to become known for excessive violence before she even got her fucking license. The force of the blast carried her in the opposite direction of the villain she was fighting. But unlike the thug that rolled to crumpled heap, Katsumi vaulted off a single arm, landing lightly on her feet. She rushed the remaining villain with a running slide tackle. Not the most elegant of takedowns, but it proved particularly effective in grounding the tallest of the villains. The man's legs seemed to be elongated and constructed of an odd metallic material. Given the proper opportunity to abuse the extra reach, such a simple quirk could pose a threat in a straight-up kickboxing match. But this was hardly a show match, and Katsumi was hardly a fair fighter. As her sudden attack threw off the taller villain's unstable balance, she quickly leaped up level with the man's shoulders, delivering a staggering axe kick to the crest of his temple. The villain jolted at the impact, before his eyes rolled to the back of his head, and he toppled over backward with a heavy thud. Katsumi landed lightly on the balls of her feet, primed and ready for more, but after a quick survey of the area, she realized the rest of the villains had actually run the fuck away. Fucking seriously? If this was the best these idiots could throw at her, then their plan was doomed before it could begin. She paced in agitation, the adrenaline from the fight, as disappointing as it was, still coursed through her veins, her palms still sparking dangerously. Kirishima gaped at her like a fucking whale shark, as if she wouldn't dispose of the fodder as easily as she had. The hell did he think she was? Bakugo-chan, that was totally cool, but don't you think we should look for the others? If we're still in the USJ, then that means they are too. I'm worried about the guys who can't really fight for themselves. He paused, glancing around as if searching for something. Aren't you worried about Midoriya? Didn't he jump in after us? Katsumi continued her pacing, stepping over the bodies of the unconscious villains without a second glance. Don't need to, he's up there, she said, jerking a thumb up to where she knew Izuku circled overhead. Kirishima followed the direction of her gesture, gazing up at the nerd as he grew closer to their specific rooftop. Shit, you're right, how'd you know he was up there? Wait, on second thought, why didn't he come down and help us? He said, frowning slightly. The fuck did you just say 2 seconds ago? Care for brains? The redhead paused briefly, eyes widening in realization just as Izuku dropped the last several meters to the roof, landing in a crouch. Katsumi shoved the idiotic feelings that rose to her chest at the mere sight of the nerd to the wayside, in favor of the more immediate danger their classmates were all in. You two all right? Izuku said without preamble. He eyed the surrounding villains before his gaze settled on Katsumi. Fine, she said lowly. What's going on, nerd? He heaved a heavy sigh. From what I could see up there, the warp quirk user, Kirajiri, I think his name was, sent most of us to different parts of the USJ. Though this place is bloody huge, so I couldn't see everyone from just overhead. Were these guys were waiting for you when you dropped out of the portal? Yeah, dude. The shark-toothed extra cut in. They totally had us surrounded, but Bakugo took him out like nothing. Of course I did, she hissed. They were weak as shit, and even if they weren't, they were all melee fighters. So they planned to split us up ahead of time, but had no knowledge of our own quirks? Looks like it. She bit out. Midoriya. Kirishima hedged uncertainly. You didn't happen to see 13-sensei while you were up there, did you? He's probably got his hands full since we rushed ahead like that. None of this woulda happened if we just let him suck up that miss dude. Kirishima continued, heedless of her interruption. As men, we gotta accept responsibility. Katsumi finally took advantage of the pause in action to settle her beef with the red-headed idiot. What the fuck will it take to get it through your head that I am not a man? She said venomously, punctuating each sentence with a harsh jab to his chest. Familiar corded arms coiled around her waist, instantly calming her ire, not to mention nearly turning her into a puddle of goo. Now's not the time, Kaken, Izuku whispered gently in her ear. I couldn't see the main plaza from here, he said, turning to the boy she'd nearly forgotten by this point. The smoke from the conflagration zone is blocking my view. The hardening quirk user visibly deflated at the non-confirmation. I wouldn't worry too much about it, Kirishima. Kaken would have gone for the takedown regardless of if you'd followed or not. Izuku turned to face her. Anything you can tell me about the warp gate user? I clipped something solid with my kick, she said, recalling the metallic clang her boot had made minutes earlier. I could get him first try if I got another shot, she growled. The thought of that shitty warp villain getting the drop on her even slightly really pissed her off. I'm gonna make sure everyone's all right, Izuku said determinedly. His skyboard hummed with power, the sound strangely comforting to Katsumi for reasons she had no time to ponder. "I'll come with you." Kirishima volunteered immediately, but Izuku was already shaking his head. "You'll only slow me down," Izuku said, though not unkindly. "You and Kaken should head towards to the exit and see if you can reconnect with 13. I'll send anyone I can find over there so you can all get out together." Katsumi met Izuku's piercing jade eyes for a single frozen moment before giving in to the urge that had been tugging at her since he'd dropped out of the sky. Heedless of the redhead watching curiously, Katsumi quickly closed the distance between her and Izuku, crushing her lips to his own. She grinned into his mouth as he rolled with her spur-of-the-moment decision, deepening the kiss shortly before breaking off just as abruptly. Katsumi flushed as she was left practically whimpering in need. "Be safe, Kaken." With a gust of wind, he was gone, carried away in a split second by his quirk. The silence stretched on uncomfortably. Not a fucking word. Hair for brains. "Why ya?" Tashinori. All Might had never imagined he'd be fighting evildoers in the very building where his students were meant to save lives. But if there was one lesson he'd learned over his many years of heroing, it was to expect the unexpected. He should have followed his own advice. Yagi stared down the unnerving blue-haired young man, beginning to regret the hours he'd spent stopping petty crime that morning. He suppressed a shiver at the sight of the severed hands hanging limply off Tamura's body. There was only so much experience could prepare you for. The clashes, clangs, and various other sounds of battle echoed over the wide plaza as Shoyuta fought off the amassed villains. But even from a glance it was apparent that they stood no match against the pro's superior speed and technique. In a less dire situation, it would have been a pleasure to observe his colleagues' battle prowess in person. It was an opportunity rarely offered to anyone with the way the man operated in the shadows. But in this situation, it could turn dire in an instant. "Is it finally time, Sensei?" The man, Tamura, All Might vaguely remembered, spoke out loud, scratching viciously at his neck. A nervous habit from the looks of it, judging by the irritated patches of skin surrounding his collar. All Might frowned, the title wedged an uncomfortable feeling into his gut, a twinge that was much different than the constant lancing pains of his injury. However, those pains were significantly more immediate, a relentless reminder of how little time he truly had left. After a surprising amount of villain attacks that morning, All Might was left with barely enough time to cover this planned afternoon lesson. He doubted he'd even have been able to last the whole period. But, with a stubborn streak to match his strength, All Might had insisted on coming anyway, intending to duck out of class in the last half hour or so. But now, he inwardly cursed his inability to ignore a person in need. It was the basis of his career as a hero, but even Yagi had to admit it got him into some sticky situations. However, overcoming those situations was what made him who he was, limited to 3 hours a day or not. The warped villain from earlier had already swirled away doing who knows what else to his students, but he had to trust their safety to young 13 for the time being. They were all pros, and despite the overwhelming need he felt to protect his young protégés, they all had a job to do, and he was well aware of his. All Might leveled an appropriate glare at the apparent leader of this so-called assassination attempt. "Tamura, is it?" he boomed across the distance between them. "As dire as your actions have been so far, you've yet to actually hurt anyone, young man. It is not too late to cease this pointless violence." The man let out a sinister chuckle, as if his words were particularly comical. "Violence, huh?" His voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "Have a look over there," he shouted, slashing a hand, his own hand, through the air towards where Aizawa fought his minions. "That looks pretty violent to me, no? This is the cruel world of heroes and villains. The only difference between us is that your violence is government-sponsored." The villain took off with an inhuman burst of speed. However, it was not Yagi he rushed, but Aizawa while he was occupied with a trio of villains with minor speed quirks. Eraserhead had just managed to subdue them, exploiting a speedster's obvious weakness to being restrained, limiting their boosted mobility. Tamura had timed the strike at a perfect moment of weakness, right as Erasure wore off and Aizawa was unable to use it for a few seconds. In another situation, All might have been impressed by the boy's deductive ability, breaking down the weakness in his colleague's quirk in seconds. But this wasn't class, and Tamura was not one of his students. If the villain thought he'd just stand by and let him blindside Aizawa so brazenly, then he truly didn't know who he was challenging. All Might flashed after the speeding villain, appearing before him in the blink of an eye. He reached out a single massive hand, ready to knock out the boy as humanely as possible. A simple superpower chopped the back of the neck should have been enough. He felt his shadowed eyes widen slightly as Tamura fluidly ducked around his attack. What impressive agility! And from what he could tell, there was no overt application of a quirk. What a waste of obvious talent. All Might tracked the boy's movement through the air, adjusting for this new show of speed. How unfortunate that the boy would likely be locked away for life after this day, never to display such talent to the world again. All Might swung a massive arm toward the dodging villain with a bit more applied speed than before, feeling the impact a moment later. Tamura was sent rocketing to the ground, spread eagle and back flattened against the unforgiving dirt. All Might quickly pinned the wheezing young man, primed to respond to any indication that he would make another threatening move. "So T, this is your overwhelming strength, symbol of peace," Tamura coughed thickly, though the malice still bled through his labored breaths. "I hate pro-heroes. Ordinary villains simply don't stand a chance." Malevolent crimson eyes peeked through scruffy bangs and grotesque hanging fingers, causing that same unnerving sensation to return. "But you miscalculated," Tamura grinned up at him. "I'm not the final boss." A hulking black mass blurred past where All Might had Tamura pinned, moving with a speed something of that size shouldn't be capable of. His head snapped to watch, unable to respond in time as the demonic being collided with an unsuspecting Aizawa and sent him hurling into the wall of the central fountain. The underground hero's frame crashed into the wall. Elegant concrete engravings pulverized from the force of impact. Jagged cracks expanded from the location, leaking trickles of water onto the shattered tiles of the plaza floor. A lance of fear shot through Yagi's chest to join the more visceral side effects of his injury. Arms weren't meant to bend that way. However, his attention was once again drawn to the young man before him, only this time by an agonizing burning sensation. Tamura had snaked a single splayed hand to just barely brush the now exposed skin of his lower thigh. The thin material of his hero suit had been disintegrated in an instant, his skin following soon after. All Might leaped away from whatever was rendering his skin to dust, righteous fury coursing through his veins. His brief moment of leniency had possibly cost Aizawa several broken bones, if not more. It was an oversight he went to immediately correct. The dark abomination stalked after Shoyuta, swinging another massive fist overhead, mercilessly eager to see if there were any bones left unbroken. The guillotine of a blow crunched redundantly into Aizawa's downed figure, but the monster clearly hadn't had enough, swinging back another arm to finish the job. A burst of one for all, and All Might rocketed across the plaza. Fortunately, he crashed into the muscular villain in time to prevent any hits as devastating as the first, but Aizawa was still in a less than stellar condition. He sat hunched against the stone wall of the fountain, battered, bleeding, and incapable of moving. Unconsciousness might have been a blessing at this point. All Might stood locked fist to mighty fist with the villain who, by some terrifying means, had come upon a strength that rivaled his own. His muscles bulged as he actually struggled to overpower the monstrous being. All Might suppressed a hacking cough, feeling the familiar pangs that indicated overuse of his quirk, but soldiered on. Now was hardly the time to succumb to such a weakness. Not while his friends' lives were on the line. Not while his students were counting on him. He gently, ever so gently drew from the shrinking well of power that was one for all. Even having yet to choose a successor, his body's capacity to handle the power was gradually dwindling. By this point, his quirk was probably the only thing keeping his body functioning in the first place, but he couldn't afford to hold back here. All Might reared back a single trunk-like arm, the familiar power writhing merrily beneath the surface of his skin. All Might clenched his butt, torqued his core and back, and yelled with all his might, "Texuasis Smaz!" He swung a devastating fist directly into the abomination's stomach, bracing himself for the expected kickback. But it never came. The attack had connected. He was sure of it, but other than a slight grunt at the impact, the monster gave no indication that he had been hit. It was almost as if Yagi's strength had no effect. The monster swung an inky black fist into his crippling injury with an uncanny accuracy, immediately earning a grimace of pain and lung-racking cough for its efforts. Did this monstrosity know of his weakness? That attack was no accident. But how? All Might leaped away to reassess the situation, being sure to remain between the crumpled form of Eraserhead and the hulking villain. Surprised, All Might? Tamura laughed hysterically as he shakily regained his footing. I'd like to introduce you to Nomu, the anti-symbol of peace. His shock absorption can stand up to even your absurd strength. The beast charged with that same inhuman speed, pursuing All Might with an almost animalistic fury. All Might met the charge head-on, shouldering the blow before letting loose another powerful hook with his left, following up with an uppercut to the beast's jaw. Nothing. Even the shock directly to the skull, a force that would even knock out some of the tougher villains he'd faced in his time, was shaken off with barely a flinch. The beast latched its arms around his torso in a steely grip, filling his nostrils with the cloying scent of rot and something else that reminded him of hospitals. All Might thrashed fruitlessly before Nomu turned, flinging him clear across the plaza. All Might tumbled through the dirt, coming to a crashing halt against the sloping dome of the storm zone. He'd admit that one actually hurt a bit. All Might visibly struggled to his feet, thankful that none of his students were here to see him in such a sorry state. He paused to cough painfully into a fist, wiping away the expected stain of scarlet without a thought. Nomu? Huh? All Might peered with narrowed eyes at the monstrous villain, noting the gaping, beak-like maw lined with rows of jagged teeth, and its brain matter so obviously displayed for the world's viewing pleasure. Its eyes were bulging and vacant, and All Might really couldn't see any sort of consciousness behind them. It was like some twisted science experiment gone wrong, and by this point he was debating with himself whether the beast was even human, as monstrous as some quirks made people appear. At the end of the day, there was always the underlying threat of humanity, but this abomination lacked even that. Where did he even come from? No, that was irrelevant for the moment. He only needed to figure out how to stop it. He could wail into a shock absorber all he wanted, but it wouldn't do anything besides kick up a lot of dust. It wasn't the first time he'd come across such a quirk before. If that's how they wanted to play it, then let's see how it dealt with something a bit more creative. All Might appeared behind the hulking monster in a burst of speed and latched his arms around its massive torso. If he couldn't beat it straight out, then burying it 6 feet under, in the most literal sense of the phrase, would probably be the next best thing. With a mighty heave, All Might swung the gargantuan villain in a pendulous arc over his shoulder, and directly into a swirling vortex of darkness. Izuku. The closest zone to the one he'd been deposited in was the landslide simulation, and logically the first he flew to look over after leaving Kaken and Kirishima. He needn't have bothered. All that was left of the once earthy landslide zone was a frozen wasteland. The frosty blue-white hills sloped on for hundreds of meters, all clearly originating from a single point in the center of the mock village. As Izuku descended, crystallized statues adorning the landscape came into view, though on closer inspection he realized they were actually people encased in that same jagged ice, their heads left uncovered, presumably so they wouldn't suffocate. Was this Todoroki's work? Izuku knew of the boy's quirk, of course, but seeing the sheer scale of the destruction he could unleash with only his right side was humbling. Izuku landed in a crouch, quicksteel revolving around his head, primed and ready to react to any sudden movements by the frozen villains. But they made no indication of aggression. In fact, those closest to where he'd touched down appeared downright terrified at his appearance. Hey man, we don't want any trouble. The closest of them shivered. Why yeah, we give up. This was a dumb idea anyway. Who the hell tries to take out All Might? Shit, whatever Todoroki had done had put the fear of God into these guys. Though being frozen alive probably wasn't the most pleasant way to go, Izuku willed a portion of quick steel into a floating blade, leaving it humming against the man's jugular. The boy that was here earlier, what happened to him? Whoa man, we said we give up, alright? What is it with you overpowered UA kids? The quick steel blade inched closer. He took off towards the plaza maybe 2 minutes ago. I swear. Izuku let the blade converge back into the main mass of his quirk. Appreciate the info, he grinned. If you guys just chill here, I'm sure the police will find you eventually. Their responding groans may have not had anything to do with the ice. Izuku took to the sky once more. So, Todoroki was already on his way to the plaza, huh? He squinted through the windshield, actually having to look up at the next closest zone. The true scale of the USJ complex was really put into perspective considering they'd managed to fit a miniature mountain range indoors. The massive simulation area sprawled all the way to the ceiling of the USJ, sloping back to level ground the closer one traveled towards the plaza. But Izuku needed to go up. The earthy hills of the landslide zone slowly became more rocky and jagged as Izuku wove through the increasingly larger cliffs. It was as he slicked over a final ridge that a group of people came into view. Izuku dove, slicing towards the ground at a blistering pace, but as the figures grew larger, he came to realize that his classmates had once again proven their competence, dealing with the villains in the time it had taken him to reach them. Midoriya-san, what are you doing here? Yaoyorozu said from her place, under some sort of blanket. Now that he had a closer look, it seemed Jiro was under there with her too. Was she naked? What the hell had gone down over here? Wei, PFFD ya. Jiro-san, this is hardly the time. Izuku blinked, waiting for his brain to reboot. Alright, someone's gonna have to fill me in. And Yaoyorozu, could you put some clothes on? Please. Izuku said, averting his eyes. Oh, she gasped, flushing and pulling the cloth around her tightly. A fluorescent blue glow was visible briefly underneath before she removed the covering, revealing her entire hero outfit. Good as new. Handy, he commented frankly. Though to be fair, Momo's hero costume was hardly any less distracting. He may be firmly committed to Kaken, but he'd have to be blind to not notice how beautiful some of the girls in his class were. Yaoyorozu in particular was quite the developed woman, and the scarlet leotard certainly didn't hurt her appeal. Izuku smirked at the betrayed look Jiro shot him. It seemed she was quite enjoying herself under there, but time was of the essence. I'm glad you guys are okay. Well, actually, are you okay? He said, eyeing Kaminari in particular as he roamed the rocky ground, shooting double thumbs up in random directions. He's FPFFD fine, Jiro said, barely containing her snickers as the blonde let out another. Wei. He goes all loopy when he lets loose with his quirk, though now that I think about it, he never said how long this would last, she continued, fighting through her snickers. Izuku nodded thoughtfully. I can probably get to all the zones faster than most, so I'm just checking up on everyone I can find. I'd offer you a lift out, but I don't think I can take 3. It would probably be in our best interest for us 3 to stay together rather than risk slowing you down, Momo said, some of her embarrassment dying down. As you can see, we are no longer in danger. Besides, it seems Kaminari-san will need a supervisor for the near future. Sounds good, Izuku said, hopping onto his quick steel and hovering at eye level. I'll send anyone else I find to the entrance. We can meet up there. Hopefully the warp villain will be distracted enough to get out. But if not, we can figure it out then. Both girls stood curiously wide-eyed, but a moment later it clicked. Momo had never seen him fly before, and Jiro had probably only seen it through a monitor. Izuku didn't really put any stock in the way Katsumi had raved about how cool his quirk was in private, thinking it may have been her narcissism bleeding into her opinion of him. But judging from the girl's reactions, it may have had some merit to it. Stay safe, he shouted, zipping off. Any other time and Izuku would have been having the time of his life surfing through a fucking canyon. But now, speed was all that mattered. He leaned forward, near, horizontal over his board as he carved a path down the mountainside and straight into the smoky skyline of the conflagration zone. If he didn't know any better, Izuku would have really believed a small town was suffering a major catastrophe below him. Pitch-black smoke billowed out from the smoldering remains of unidentifiable structures. Some areas of the mock city were still visibly on fire, but everywhere he looked, destruction was the only constant. Smoke clogged his lungs and brought stinging tears to his scrunched eyes. He was practically riding blind by this point, but just as he was about to abort any search for his classmates, at least in this zone, he came across the knocked-out bodies of several thuggish-looking individuals. They all either wore filtration masks or possessed quirks that would allow them to survive in the noxious fumes of the surrounding fire. All except one, whose mask seemed to have been hastily removed, knocking his goggles askew. Izuku quickly peered around as best he could through the hazy air, but relaxed a bit seeing none of his classmates among the fallen. It seemed that one of them had been there, but like the rest, had taken care of themselves. Pride in his classmates swelled in his chest, along with an increasingly urgent need for clean air. It was time to move on. Izuku hastily surged through the billowing smoke, cutting his own slipstream with his speed until he finally exited the allocated area for the conflagration zone. Incredibly, the air quality immediately improved. How the engineers that worked on the USJ had managed that, Izuku wasn't sure, but he had to give them props for authenticity. The burning in his lungs was certainly no illusion. Izuku surged through the air into the next zone, the overwhelming abundance of blue that suddenly filled his vision almost as startling as the lack of smoke. This was apparently what UA's engineers had come up with for the flood zone. But wasn't this going a bit overboard? There was a difference between flood and no land in the first place. A piercing wail echoed over the expanse of water, just as Izuku zeroed in on the only speck of movement in the otherwise calm lake. A massive yacht floated around the center of the lake, though floated was being a bit generous. The ominous crack that bisected the hull of the ship probably meant the vessel had mere minutes of buoyancy left in it. Izuku's eyes flew open at the sight of Tsu and Mineta stranded on the boat, surrounded by perhaps the largest gathering of villains he'd seen that day, disregarding the group amassed at the entrance, of course. They all clearly shared some sort of aquatic-themed ability, following the trend of all the previous zones. This aspect of the villain's plan clearly wasn't very polished. He'd already known that the groups of villains arranged throughout the USJ were selected based on their quirks, but now that he'd been to nearly every zone it was clear they'd given zero thought to even the size of their groups. He swooped down, coming to a stop in front of his two classmates. "Need a lift?" "Midoriya," Mineta wailed, his eyes bulging out of his skull. "Nice timing, Karo," Tsuyu said with a composure that contradicted her situation. "I can carry you if you can't balance well, but—" "Yes, please." "Oh, I get it." Mineta burst out. "I try to cop a little feel as my dying wish and I get flattened. But Midoriya over here just flexes stupid muscles and you just—" "Arg," he trailed off. Izuku wasn't quite sure what to make of the sudden outburst. So shall we go?" "Yeah, sure, whatever." The diminutive boy sighed despondently. Tsuyu hopped onto his skyboard which he widened appropriately, but the girl made almost zero use of the extra space, clinging tightly to his torso. Izuku did his best to ignore the way the frog girl's curves pressed up against his body as he scooped up a still pouting Mineta, and then zipped off towards the closest bank. The villains below almost immediately responded to the attempted escape. A giant blade of rushing water sliced through his escape route, the slow-moving projectile proving more trouble than it normally would, burdened as he was by two extra bodies. He halted his escape, letting the attack fly past the nose of his board. How unfortunate that such a powerful hydrokinesis quirk was being abused by a villain. Izuku ducked the barrage of water bullets the villain fired after his first attack, materializing a shield of quick steel to block what he couldn't avoid. Even hindered as he was, the superior maneuverability of his flight allowed them to escape with only minor scratches. He slowed to a halt at the edge of the flood zone, turning to see if they'd been pursued. But once he and his fellow classmates had escaped past a certain distance, the villains had abandoned their chase. Perhaps they'd been given specific instructions to remain in their area? Either way, they were safe for the moment. It seems that luck was on their side as Tokoyami and Kuda came dashing out of the downpour zone, soaked, scraped and bruised to hell, but otherwise uninjured. "Midoriya," Tokoyami called gravely, "I'm gladdened that you are unharmed, though I cannot say it comes as a surprise." "Same to you," Izuku said, coming to a stop in front of the pair. He let down Mineta and Tsuyu, though the latter parted somewhat hesitantly. "You guys should take a longer way around to the entrance." "You say that like you aren't coming with us, Midoriya-kun." Tsuyu fixed him with a stare. "I haven't run into Hagakure, Aoyama, or Ojiro yet, and I can stay out of reach if things get hairy." Izuku's eyes snapped to the sounds of destruction, coming with increasing frequency from the main plaza. Plus, something really doesn't feel right about this. He stared down at his classmates, steadfast in a time of danger. "I can't say leaving you behind feels correct either, Midoriya," Tokoyami said regretfully. "But you're not wrong that of all of us, you'd have the best chance of remaining unharmed. Be careful, Jiro. Koda nodded wordlessly, but still managed to convey his support. Izuku took off towards the plaza without another word, covering ground as fast as possible. The fountain soon came into view, the once massive army of villains scattered about haphazardly. However, it was as Izuku's eyes came to rest on the unmoving form of Aizawa crumpled against the rocky ledge of the fountain that the true scope of their situation became apparent. Izuku's stomach leaped to his throat as he took in the sight of All Might himself in possibly one of the most precarious situations he'd ever faced. Though only the man himself could possibly know that for sure. All Might was stuck bowed nearly in half, having attempted some kind of wrestling toss on the hulking beast from earlier. But Kurogiri's warp gate had once again proven how troubling such a power could be in the wrong hands. He'd opened 2 adjacent portals to give the monster a torturous angle of attack on the symbol of peace. The monster had already latched its powerful arms around the hero's torso, its cruel, beak-like maw stretched into a grin as it dragged All Might into the depths of the void. Izuku could pick out a familiar scarlet color seeping through the material of All Might's costume. To think that the beast could make All Might bleed. Just how powerful was this thing? Izuku tucked low to his board, squeezing out as much speed as he could as he raced to his sensei's rescue. It seemed he wasn't the only one, however, as a frosty trail of ice raced towards where All Might had been restrained. The jagged shards of ice rapidly encased both halves of the monster, though the frost avoided touching the symbol of peace. Izuku seamlessly hopped off his board while molding it straight into a coating over his forearms. Midoriya Shonen, you should not be here. I hack. The man hacked violently, a spray of crimson speckling the ice below. That couldn't be good. All Might had clearly seen better days. He was giving off so much heat he practically steamed. The sight was not particularly encouraging to Izuku. All Might may be even more injured than he'd first thought. You're hardly in any condition to be picky, sensei. Izuku shouted. He did his best not to cringe away from the gaping maw of the villain. Even crystallized into a frozen statue, the thing was terrifying, unnatural in a way Izuku had never seen or felt before. Izuku molded a narrow blade of quick steel, slashing across the tendons of the monster's wrists, flinching away from the spray of inhumanly dark ichor that spurted from the cut. You don't understand, young. You can scold me later. With a great heave, Izuku tore All Might from the monster's weakened grip, propping him over his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. He winced at the grimace that contorted the hero's face as he let out more heaving coughs with alarming frequency. What kind of damage had the man taken to leave him in such a condition? Had the monster really done all this to him? Izuku leaped away, grunting slightly at the massive weight of the #1 hero, but otherwise able to lift him out of the way. Another portal swirled into existence before him, the owner of the cork materializing a moment later. Quite admirable, young hero, but do you really think we just let you waltz away with the guest of honor? You don't got a fucking choice. Boom. Katsumi burst onto the scene with impeccable timing, flanking the warp villain with an explosive haymaker. Having adjusted her aim from her previous attempt, the blow struck true, rattling Kurogiri's metallic collar with the impact. Katsumi let the momentum of her swing carry her fully over the warp villain's clearly tangible body, pinning him to the floor with a palm full of fire. I fucking knew it, you bastard. You actually tried to dodge before, right? Katsumi growled viciously. Her hand crackled threateningly at the slightest movement. If we couldn't hit you at all, you wouldn't have bothered. All that fog's just a cheap trick to hide your weak spot. Huh. I thought we agreed to meet at the entrance, Kaken? Same to you, nerd, she said, not taking her eyes off her captive. Just couldn't keep your nose out of things, huh? I couldn't help myself, he grinned, propping All Might up against the main fountain, just a few meters away from where Aizawa lay unconscious. Is Kirishima okay? I left shitty hair with the rest of the extras, she said, grinding the villain's body brutally into the concrete as he flinched slightly. Izuku grinned. Guess you couldn't keep your nose out either. Somebody had to save your ass. Is this really the time? Todoroki said, strolling over to where they stood with their backs to the fountain. He held a casual air, but the razor focus was obvious in the glare he leveled at the remaining villain. Frost ghosted from his breath, an indication that he'd recently used his quirk. Not that Izuku needed any more evidence than the frozen villain towering over the rest of them. Tamura's distinct wheezy drawl silenced them all. "Not only have you disabled our transport, but you're all at full health. Kurogiri, you just had to go and get caught by the other team." He stood much too casually for the situation he was in. Even with All Might's mysterious ailment, the villain still stood alone. All major pieces in his twisted chess match put out of commission for the time being. So why was he so calm? A hysterical giggle slowly bubbled out of Tamura's throat. "Today's kids really are something. Our League of Villains should be ashamed. This guy's unhinged," Izuku said lightly. "Don't fucking move," Katsumi hissed at the warped villain. "One twitch and I'll blow you to fucking hell. Nomu, kill the explosive brat. We need our escape route back." The shattering of ice could be heard all throughout the plaza, as the beastly villain, Nomu, tore itself out of its frigid prison. The monster thrashed about, heedless of how frostbitten flesh crumbled away from its torso, falling to the ground with hiss. A few horrifying seconds later and Nomu stood before them, the majority of its right arm and leg missing completely, until it started to heal. Writhing tendrils of muscle and skin knitted itself together at a blistering pace. The whole process really was grotesquely fascinating. Izuku had never even heard of a regenerative quirk so powerful, and if the thing was strong enough to go toe-to-toe with All Might of all heroes, what exactly was this thing? "What's this?" "I thought his quirk was shock absorption?" All Might gasped, confirming Izuku's earlier fears. The symbol of peace struggled to regain his footing, burdened by wounds that clearly surpassed the cuts and bruises that were visible on the surface. "I don't remember saying that's all he can do." Tamura giggled. "This is hyper-regeneration. Nomu is a living sandbag bioengineered to withstand everything you throw at it." Honestly, Izuku was more alarmed by its speed. Nomu rocketed towards Katsumi in a vicious charge, steadfastly following its master's homicidal command. All Might lurched by his side as if moving to block the blow, but was overcome by another round of coughs, falling to one knee. Luckily, Izuku had instinctively moved to protect her as well, barely appearing in time to tank the blow with a quick steel-coated cross-guard. The impact rattled his frame, and for a moment Izuku thought he might have lost consciousness. He was launched halfway across the plaza, barely keeping upright as he skidded to a halt with a gasp of air. His ears rung from the impact, and Izuku could have sworn his forearm was smoking slightly. It certainly felt like it was on fire. "Ho!" Tamura growled dangerously. "That's the anti-symbol of peace there, kid. What kind of power-ups are they giving these UA brats?" Todoroki sent another massive wave of ice racing after Nomu as it came to a stop, but it was no longer locked in place by a warp gate, leaving it free to dodge away with an earth-shaking leap. Nomu landed in a crouch, leveling a single, bulging eye on Izuku, clearly frustrated at being denied its kill. The beast lunged, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye, but luckily, he was prepared this time. Izuku slipped through the grasping arms of the massive villain, abusing the slight advantage he may have had in agility. But even that slight advantage hardly guaranteed his safety. Each thunderous swing from the monster could potentially end him in a moment, and even with a coating of quick steel, its glancing blows had Izuku's bones creaking under the impact. So instead, Izuku weaved through the swipes, redirecting, rather than blocking completely, and lashed out with quick steel-enhanced strikes in the brief opportunity between attacks. Nomu was largely unaffected, but after seeing the beast regrow limbs in seconds, that wasn't exactly surprising. Izuku darted away, trying to buy as much time as possible for All Might to recover from whatever was currently ailing him. Nomu blitzed after him like an indigo demon. He slid to a stop, squaring his stance and facing the charging villain, resolution glinting in his eye. He couldn't keep this up, not against this being of seemingly limitless strength and stamina. If even punches from All Might couldn't make it flinch, then attempting the same would only be a waste of time. The key had to be suppression. All Might may have been interrupted in his first attempt at restraining the beast, but the hero's logic was perfectly sound. The majority of Izuku's quick steel seeped off his arms to form a metallic shield, a clear invitation for Nomu to test its strength. But as the rampaging beast slammed into the quick steel dome with a bone-chilling roar, it was not the sturdy surface it expected. but a pliable, sludge-like consistency. Izuku ducked out of the way as Nomu sank into his quick steel, latching tendrils of the material around the beast and solidifying them a moment later. The Nomu's powerful body bulged as it tried to muscle its way of newly formed metallic cage. Izuku hung on for dear life, the stress from restraining such an overwhelming power with quick steel making itself known with a splitting headache. "Todoroki, can you freeze it again?" he shouted. Nomu, as if vaguely understanding his shout, bucked like a raging bull in attempt to dislodge its captor. But barring the throbbing pain in his head, it looked like his quick steel would hold strong for the moment. "Deku, Wacho, as if I'd let you." A vice-like grip latched onto Izuku's left forearm, instantly disintegrating the thin layer of quick steel that remained. The flesh of his wrist followed shortly after. "Ea wa aga." The scream tore from his lips unconsciously, echoing across the plaza. It was like someone had poured lava over his wrist, such was the blinding, blistering, all-consuming agony that engulfed his arm. Tamura had apparently avoided attention in the chaos of the skirmish, hiding his presence until the perfect moment. The villain slipped into his blind spot the minute Izuku focused all his attention on restraining Nomu, locking himself in place. And now, the flesh of his wrist crumbled. It hurt. He never felt so absolutely debilitated by an injury before, and it wouldn't stop. Izuku's eyes snapped to Tamura's other hand as it loomed towards his exposed neck, retaining enough awareness to lurch away from his grasping fingers. The motion sent another spike of agony lancing up his arm, breaking the last of his conscious control over quick steel. Nomu thrashed out of his weakened prison. Todoroki's eyes had reached their position, beginning to encase Nomu's monstrous feet, but Izuku knew it was too late. In a moment that seemed to stretch on endlessly, Izuku met a single, scarlet eye peeking through the digits of Tamura's disturbing face mask. Would his hand join the many that adorned the villain's body? The searing agony of his flesh disintegrating snapped him back to reality. The Nomu turned, its beak-like jaws drooling viciously, as jagged shards of ice lanced mercilessly through its legs. It wasn't enough. Nomu swung a massive fist, swatting away the annoyance that had dared try to capture it. Izuku mustered a half-hearted block with his right arm, but he might as well have guarded with a piece of paper for all the good it did. All the force that he'd been negating with his quick steel was unleashed on his unprotected body, pulverizing the bones of his arm and sending him hurtling through the air. Izuku skipped over the tiles of the plaza floor, coming rolling to a halt in a cloud of dust. Tamura hadn't let go. A desperate cry that wasn't his own echoed in Izuku's failing senses. His vision blurred as an iconic muscular silhouette slowly paced into view, spidery cracks branching out along the ground from each pendulous step. Izuku's world went black. That's a wrap for part 3 of What If Deku Had Metal Manipulation? Legends. Massive thanks to BT for another thrilling installment. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and drop a comment below with your thoughts and predictions for the next part. Your support is everything. And remember, this isn't the finale. There's more to come. So stay tuned. Until next time, stay legendary.